Hello everyone, today we talk about Italian communal armies organization between the 12th and the 13th century. This is a important topic for me because incidentally I'm involved in a research exactly about communal armies, albeit from the very late 13th, first half of the 14th century, and naturally I had to get into the details in the general bibliography existing about the communal military, its organization. So this video is actually being probably very long, as you can surely see already, and yet it's just an introduction to a topic that is actually very, very important. Most of my military themed videos are fundamentally introductory, right? These topics are immense. Like if you look at the bibliography existing on it, and in general medieval warfare, etc., there is potentially an infinite amount of videos we could make about this stuff, and this is just to set a bit the basis right? Even if it's difficult at the same time with making a video every day. And this is a topic especially that I think it's not dealt with the necessary accuracy, that is also probably not extremely popular, and that yet holds a, I would say a dramatic importance in medieval warfare, and it's overlooked for reasons that maybe at one point we will discuss more thoroughly. And especially when I hope to finish my this thesis with coronavirus, it's been a problem because probably I will have to delay the PhD for 6 months, always hoping that I will get it in the end. But naturally I will have plenty of stuff to talk about, since the thesis is going to be roughly 1,000 pages, right? So it's plenty of stuff, and to make a video that lasts even just a couple of hours about such a big topic for centuries of history in this regional theater, it sounds very approximate, and yet I will try to do my best once again to get the essentials right. So we're talking essentially about this area of central and northern Italy. We tend to miss the central side of the story most of the times. Yes, it's true that the major, the earlier, and by some standard, the most interesting developments in the Italian communal armies during specifically the 12th and 13th century are probably a northern thing, chiefly Lombard, but not only, because Lombardy, well, yes, at this point is larger than the modern region. It's more a region properly on its own. It's almost the entire Po Valley, and there is an essential homogeneity though between the armies of the central northern Italian city-states that are really literally they were the same armies, and the more time went on, actually these armies were increasingly mixed, right? Usually we see leagues, coalitions, which means that several cities put together their military potential, and they formed armies that were pretty damn considerable at the time. Effectively, some of the largest European armies at this time were put together by these city-states that had just like a provincial dimension, but had an enormous economical and demographic strength that in the specific centuries we're discussing today were increasing, right? Till the very end of the 13th century, the potential of this cities is constantly growing, right? There is a bit of a contraction towards the end, but still at that point was even an increase in the investment in military expenses, which eventually will put the system in crisis, and that's essentially what I'm studying personally and getting interested in, broadly speaking. So the 12th and 13th century is the moment of glory in which also the Italian communal armies objectively achieve certain tactical results that basically you don't see elsewhere in Europe, and that eventually will be surpassed by the infantry victories of the early 14th century by the side of the Flemish, the Scots, the Swiss, the Dithmarschen, and the English too, in a very peculiar way though. But the Italians were path openers for the development of low medieval infantry, right? And there is a great discriminant in this regard. The 12th and 13th century are moments in which cavalry in Western Europe has the upper hand. Like we don't see any proper victory of infantry on it. Many of you will say, oh, look at Lignano, look at these battles. Well, those were not actually infantry victories, because if you look at them, the decisive arm there were still cavalry, right? But that's exactly the point. I mean, the performance of the Lombard and Tuscan infantries, but not only on the field in these years, is pretty damn amazing, given the resistance of the infantry, right, against cavalry specifically, which was something that usually wasn't even contemplated in other areas of Europe, right, especially during the 13th century. You know, we know in the major battles were fought across Europe, including Italy, we sometimes don't even get much information about infantry, because we know it was there, but you know, the dominating, you know, chivalric oriented, let's say, historiography tended to concentrate everything on the knights and on the feudal elite, etc., and kind of overshadowing the role of infantry that, in spite of all, also in other European regions actually was important, right? But that was still subordinated, this is the key word, to heavy cavalry, right? And the point of being decisive in a battle means that this starts happening from Courtrai in 1302 onwards for roughly less than 50 years, with, you know, tens of victories of infantries. It happens because infantries are able at that point to withstand heavy cavalry alone, that is, without the support of other cavalry, like instead was the case. So that's pretty important, and that trend will be in turn, however, cut in the mid-14th century, right? There is not a continuous line of infantry victories throughout the 14th century. There is not the idea that cavalry is now overshadowed in turn by infantry. That will not happen until the mid-15th century, you know, starting with the Swiss and generalizing itself eventually in the 16th. But still, when we look at the armies of the early 14th century and the infantries, especially of the early 14th century, and the ones that will come later with the Swiss model, we are looking at two entirely different things. Like the first group are popular infantries brought there, people who had neither even taken a weapon in their hands from the mid 14th century, 15th century, excuse me. You look at the Swiss model, right? That at that point, like the Swiss had been protagonists also of victories of the infantry in the 14th century, but that was something very, 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 very different, right? The mid-15th century, Swiss come up with a professional force of pikemen, right? That up to that time, nobody had the strength to put together, to train intensively, and that was something completely different in its tactical potential compared to the early infantries of let's say, of the earlier infantries in the 14th century. This is something I digress always on, because there's a bit of confusion on it, but at the same time you can look at the prodromes of what would happen later on in late Middle Ages, exactly starting from Italy in the 12th and in the 13th century. Another area during these centuries that was active in that sense was Flanders, but was relatively, you know, still a bit more framed. You know, the Flemish potential bursted in really towards the second half of the 13th, the end of the 13th century. There were certain ambushes and, you know, other traps that the Flemish managed to set against cavalry, butchering down the nobility. Even if you look at Bouvines at the beginning of the 13th century, you see that the Flemish get themselves chopped down to pieces till the very last man, right? While all the, you know, the rest of the Anglo-German army had been defeated by the French. So you can see, especially, in Italy and Flanders, this tendency that now we don't have the reason to explain why. Today we focus chiefly on the Italian communal armies, and realizing, in fact, what the context is first and foremost. So if you look at the communes of Italy at this point, you see that there is a strong and long tradition of self-dependence, dating back to late Roman times, right? This cities in Italy had remained active since that point, having their own militias, having their own elites, right? And naturally, in the early medieval times, we don't know much about it in the first place, but we know that these communities were active, political and military speaking. And towards the High Middle Ages, now when the Commune emerges as a ruling republic, we can say in some form, these were when effectively the imperial control on Italy is vanishing after Ottonian times, and these cities are spreading like crazy in terms of economic power and even in fact control in the surrounding territory, which is something you don't find in the rest of Europe, right? In the rest of Europe, cities can be very powerful, but they basically don't have the strength to extend their territorial control outside the city walls proper, right? If you look even at free German cities that have also in there a very interesting tradition, outside the walls there are the princes, there is heavy cavalry, and that's what it is. The Italian city-states instead essentially managed to expand on their districts and their countrysides and beyond, that is against other cities, because the Italian map is dotted with essentially with city districts, and that's from the city that every ruler, every domination in Italy had always worked at that point. Still, when I say Italy is at this point is chiefly the center of the north, right? There were communes also in the south, right? The Kingdom of Sicily had their own communes. Even later on, they continued as a form of organization, but they were much weaker because the Normans and the other feudal powers like the Swabians, the Angevins, came later, had, in a certain sense, choked these communities that we know they were active. We know they had their militias, like normally every town in Europe had, but they didn't have the strength to counter that point politically and socially before the militarily, right? The mounted elite, right? And starting by the the same origins of the Commune. If you look at the end of the 12th century already, the great feudal estates of the nobility in the Italian countryside had basically eclipsed, right? There were families, of course, as we will see now, that retained their dominions in the countryside as a center of their power, and naturally the same city was in charge of these areas because it controlled the countryside and the land estates. Right, every citizen had its own plot of land that was worked by peasants, but other workers that were not citizens. Right, they were under the city, and they had communes on their own. We will see it better afterwards with the contado. Right, that what we count as communes weren't just the cities, like the stands of walled, demographically strong, economically powerful cities that remain still largely as, if you look at the Italian urban centers today, basically they were the same ones, right? But there were also rural communes, right? As commune means as universitas, right? In the Middle Ages in general, all over Europe, just a group of people who have a, common political goal, right? And orientation. And therefore, you basically see during the 12th, 13th century that these communes take over entirely the political control of the region. Right? This doesn't mean, as we were saying now, that there weren't feudal estates in the countryside. There were always powerful lineages that essentially maintained their estates in these rural areas, but significantly a great many of them had actually taken up residence within the local city walls, right? Building houses with tall fortified towers to substitute for castles and becoming in effect, let's say, vassals of the city councils. And maybe this is also excessive to think that they were dramatically subjected to the city, in the sense that it was the same noblemen that held the higher civic offices, right? So this is not a substitution of feudalism, but rather a variant or an alternative to the more conventional feudalism that you can see in the rest of Western Europe, right? This is very important for understanding also the army compositions of the cities, because you see that especially in the 12th century there is a general unity of intents within the city walls concerning the classes that had made up the commune, which was ruled effectively by the so-called consular class, let's say, that was also the one of the noblemen, of the knights, right? And at the beginning, there was a concord in the city as such, aside from the natural tensions could arise for whichever reason. But generally speaking, the system functioned pretty well because the elite was very inclusive, right? There was this bulk of knights that they had to serve the commune because they were richer people that could afford to fight on horseback with a full panoply, and they also lived, as a matter of fact, as military men, as knights, right? That, however, were just, a part of the families that ruled the commune that, clientelally speaking, embraced the whole population in one way or another, right? So the knights and let's say better the class that expressed them was able to embrace all these newcomers also that were at this point entering the city from the countryside, becoming richer through the most different ways, and making them become knights on their own, right? This is very important because knighthood in the Middle Ages, as you know, was known as the militia, right, in Latin. So the militia was literally, in English there is the term militia that is usually applied also to the Italian communal militias, right? But there is a terminological distinction must be done here, because if you speak of the militia for communal armies in Italy, we're not talking about what we call in modern times the militia today. This kind of unprofessional troops that are levied from, in this case, the people, the citizens, and the peasants in the countryside. We're talking about the militia proper, that is the knightly class, which is a professional elite mounted on horseback, right? And this is valid actually for all European armies. So let's try not to confuse it terminologically. But it's still meaningful because if you look at the composition, the military participation in the army, you realize that at this point all the citizenship was involved more or less in the military activities, in the sense that it was a sort of recycling of loot and reinvestment, and the military expenses that also required all a specialistic set of craftsmen, etc., made the economy work, right? Effectively, the knights in communal Italy were not just military men. They were part of clans that managed the investment in agriculture, in its diversifications, who invested in outre-mer trade, who therefore owned a lot of wealth exactly because of that reason. And at this point the city is expanding, also thanks to war, and that's why it also can progressively extend its control over the countryside, because it's effectively independent. Right now we'll see how also during the late 12th and the first half of the 13th century the situation was pretty troubled because of the wars, especially against the Hohenstaufen, and later on it would be instead a more kind of an internal clash between Italian factions, yet increasingly more tied and actually crucial for international policy in Europe, that literally gravitated around Italy at that time. And if you look at also the term, sometimes you find towns when you're talking about communal armies, these Italian towns. These are not towns, they're properly civitates in Latin, right? They are cities, and it makes an enormous difference because towns in the rest of Europe weren't anything like that, right? These are cities proper. They are massive, also infrastructural entities. They had, ask the Hohenstaufen in that regard how much it took for them to siege cities like Milan or these other cities of the Poland, but that went on like for a long time. This is something you don't find much elsewhere. It's something that dates back to the same time of Charlemagne, like when he invaded the Lombard kingdom. He besieged Pavia, the capital, for 9 months, which is something you don't find anywhere else in Carolingian military history, because these cities were definitely expanding also on a pre-existing structure that had never quite died from ancient times. And at this time especially was knowing an unprecedented level of wealth and development, right? If you wonder why these places were so important, it's very, very, very simple, right? These were some of the most intensely populated areas in Europe. 1/4 of the Europeans were Italians at this time, and especially these areas are the richest per capita actually in the world, right? And they will remain up to the 17th century. Like so lot of people, a lot of wealth per each. You have this type of policy and society, and this was I would like to stress the cultural difference at this point that followed. We talk about communal Italy also elsewhere to stress really what this produced in terms of culture, of technological development, economy. This is unprecedented in Western Europe. There's nothing like that, and it's something that in fact astonishes whoever comes there. Like the one reason also why the German emperors effectively lost their wars against this system is that they objectively didn't understand it, because it was so far from anything they had seen. They considered it as a monstrous aspect. What was this place where citizens who weren't even noble that could rule over the noblemen of feudal origin, right? It was inconceivable. It was completely new, and dealing with this with iron fist instead of trying to co-opt more intensely eventually failed, because objectively there was no way to curb to these cities in a way that could remain framed under a permanent institution. Technically, Italy was a kingdom, right? But these guys hadn't felt the need even to elect a king anymore. Why? Because they had all their own city, they all managed their own business, and they were doing pretty well, right? And when you look at the military culture of the elite, you see that it's astonishingly, however, the same, right? In spite of the origins from a juridical point of view, the problem of the nobility, etc., the same of the feudal fashion, like the retinues of the mounted men at arms of the consuls and the city rulers were essentially alike the other rest feudal cavalry in Europe, right? We will have to make a huge video now at one point to explain the major differences between the various knights in Europe, because objectively, I mean, if you take all of these prototypes, let's say you take a French knight, a German knight, a Spanish knight, an English knight, they all had kind of effectively a different political, social, and juridical background. Well, in Italy, essentially, the nobility is in the knighthood that do not always overlap, especially the more time goes on. But let's say, let's use this approximation, is a nobility of census. That is, you enter in a nobility if you're rich enough, right? And this was a very important instrument of social promotion, of competition, etc. And effectively, these citizens living in a city proper, but they still lived essentially as feudal knights. And this was a society that was intensely conflictual in many ways. Like especially the elite had this continuous lust for war, and this would create problems. Like in the 13th century, there's the major crisis of these elite that will be partially substituted by the so-called popolo, the people, right? That is properly what should look at when we think of the militia in an English sense, right? And that were non-military professional in that regard. But even in there's a blurring that occurs. But if you look, for example, the Salinguerra, that was the major, or podestà better, of Ferrara in between the 20s and the 40s of the 13th century, well, he had a personal familia, right, a retinue, of perhaps as many as 800 horsemen. Right, and this is a city, and Ferrara is not even a big deal, right? At this time, Ferrara is relatively less developed than other major Italian centuries. It's in a marshy area that they would eventually manage to have a pretty damn good and early signory that was also pretty military-oriented in that regard. But here we're talking about 800 horsemen, and we here, I don't know whether the term is actually milites or whatever, but generally speaking in the sources at that point it's indicated like that, because there is also a problem of source interpretation, like what is that we're reading when we read milites, because by the end of the 13th century, miles at that point means everybody who can fight on horseback, and that has not necessarily literally the light runners or explorers cavalry, but still troops that are counted to shock charge the enemy in the traditional way. Other times you find equites that is kind of more general, simply horsemen, not a knight. But 800 knights is what a vassal in a kingdom can have, right? This is a single city. I like to stress the quantitative dimension of this side of the story, because that's what's probably most dramatically overlooked. I call it the complex of the giant. Then we look at the political map of Europe. During that time, we see all these big chunks of kingdoms, right? Sometimes, yeah, they could, and we get attracted by them, right? Say, these were the greatest powers, because we read maps as if they were drawn in the 19th century, right? Thinking that a state is more powerful just because it's larger, right? You look at how many troops they could levy, right, and you confrontate with just a commune, right? You realize that sometimes these cities could levy an astonishing amount of troops. Consider then, in the 30s of the 14th century, the second largest military in Europe after the Kingdom of France is the La Scala Signory, right? That actually controlled at that point lots of cities in northern and central Italy, but hell, we're talking about the second largest military in Europe, and as I often say, I love the La Scala particularly because as a Ghibelline by vocation, I can't avoid to do it, as imperial vicaries of northeastern Italy. That's a big deal. But who does know about these people in the first place? And those are incidentally people who were mecenates that patronized Dante, for example, or many other literates and artists. I mean, the humanism is born through war. Let's always remember that I made a video about the condottieri, which war fueling art, right? And the status of the condottieri. That's in a later period, but it was starting by that time. And if you look at also how the knights were, institutionalized in the communal political landscape, it's really impressive. You realize that especially by the 12th century, large part of the communal politics revolve around them. The knights were usually paid at a fixed rate by the commune, right? And not only, but they have a large amount of privileges, right? They were given a pledge of good conduct for each member of such retinue. As we will see, they had other. They usually their costs, their losses were compensated partly by the commune. We'll see it later. But just for saying that there was a huge amount of money revolving around their estate and their presence in the first place, right? A knight in this time means, if you can afford the full panoply of heavily armored knights, it's as if you have a Ferrari, essentially, if not more, right? It's an enormous expense. Horses, also from a logistical point of view, consider that these cities are of dramatic opulence. They have resources that count sometimes as one of kingdoms, like Florence in the beginning of 14th century is the richest city in the entire world, right? It has a greater income than the Kingdom of England, right? So that naturally doesn't mean that this wealth is directly translated into a military might, because especially in the case of Florence, that wasn't quite the case. Got defeated by dramatically poorer communes in that background. And sorry if I shift towards the early 14th century, but that's where I live in practically. So that's a good reference. Also because consider that throughout all this time, Italy is the best documented country in Europe, but at the same time, it's of course we're not as well documented for the 12th century than we are in the late 13th, right? So even a lot of things about war are to be understood into this broader perspective on a longer time, because they essentially these armies worked quite simply, right? When people tend to have an archivistic take when study these issues because they want to dissect it to minimum, but they usually lack the general picture of the world, right? Whichever the administration, which was very advanced, all of these enormous supplies were controlled by the Commune, that had massive resources to feed enormous amount of people, great amount of wealth. Surely that's quite interesting. At the same time, armies were fundamentally similar to the ones of the rest of the continent, right? It's just that, as we will see, especially the cavalry infantry, especially numerical ratio, varied consistently, as basically the Italian armies at this point have the strongest infantries in Europe, no doubt, by any standard. I made a video about the Battle of Lignano, but it was quite old, and I have to do it again, because that's renowningly one of the most famous victories of the Lombard League, actually the most famous over the Holy Roman Imperial Army, but that was composed also largely of Italians themselves, because that's the point. But there are many other battles that show the consistency of the people and its transformation over time, right? The infantry at this point has Italian infantry since the beginning is actually qualitative. It's very similar to the Norman cavalry and switch with infantry, like in some ways. That by the end of the 11th century, wolf fights on horseback is the most likely force to make the best stand on foot, right? And there is a bit of this at the beginning of the Italian communes, where you see that there was a courageous body of infantrymen that was dramatically and heavily cuirassed, even equipped for in a very early time to fight with traumatic blunt weapons for knocking down cavalry in some ways, but also lances that was effectively what stopped them. Then eventually, towards the end of the period, what happens is that the people increase, like it takes also over, so there are largest amount of infantry, but also lesser quality. Yet at the same time, there's a tactical transformation that is increased on the base of combined arms, right? Also with the increase of crossbowmen and with the appearance of other specialistic troops that we will deal with in a while. So this is the general picture, and it would be a lot to say strictly from a political point of view what was happening in Europe and in Italy specifically concerning the clash for investitures, even partly the relations with the Byzantines and the Normans, etc. But this is, generally speaking, the dimension we're talking about. So passing to what we would call the militia, but actually the communal army proper, that was known as exercitus or oster, right, usually, well, this was essentially composed on the base of the quartieres, sesti, terzi, or porte, right? So a bit of melange of Latin and vernacular Italian. There were essentially the quarters or the gates of the city, right? So the city was split into different quarters that had each in their military organization, because they usually were controlled by a most powerful clan that had its clienteles, its craftsmen and economical activities, lands outside the city walls, usually in the sector, in fact, when this kind of different chunks were, projected themselves outwards. And they were pretty homogeneous also in their own. They had their own banners, their own saints. They had their own parishes that were usually split also in, so they attended the same church. They were a community on their own. This was very important because in a time where there is not a centralized state, which is the case of the Middle Ages in general, especially in Western Europe, you see that these communities tend to compensate the lack of above imposed discipline with a greater cohesion between the clan and family groups, right? However, in the case of the Italian city-states, you see that over time, what we call kind of a central direction is increasing, right? And there is an increase also in the of the imposed discipline, especially to certain specialistic units, right? And naturally, as we have seen, there is a distinction between the military professionals, that is the knights, and the people that has a supportive role, right, on the field. And also inside the city, because inside the city, naturally, infantry had a greater importance. That's also why the people will eventually manage, in certain cases, to ostracize the magnates, and so these greater families of the military class, but also not to be able to do much, after all, outside the city walls, when the moment will come, right? And all these quarters, so there were different names that depended on, quarter, usually when the city was divided in 4, right? But the terzi, for example, was divided in 3, the sextine in 6, right? So it goes like that, but it's essentially the same thing, right? Or porte, as we have seen, the gates, right? So from that had each quarter had its own axis, right, in the city walls. Well, these were essentially, they made up companies on their own, right? They had cavalry and infantry, and as we have seen, they usually were people who knew each other, were tied by certain relations of clientele. In fact, that this tradition of splitting the military service among the quarters is very ancient. We've seen it. We were talking about Merovingian armies, for example, in a completely different context in the 6th century. But in Italy, we witnessed this eventually this continuity since Roman times, because usually in late antiquity, eventually these things died out. Like so, the 6th century, maybe in France, that's where the Roman cities kept producing a bit of militia, but then disappeared. In Italy, we find it once again as early as 705, Ravenna, for example, that had divided its own army into 12 companies, while Rome's division into 7 companies may have even predated that. And this is absolutely normal. Consider that by that time, it's a miracle to know anything in the first place about military organization in absolute terms. I would like to specify, though, that since we mentioned Rome, that here we're talking really about the whole picture, right? But I will make different videos about specifically the Papal States or Venice or other powers. We will see now how for this time, naturally, in especially from the 14th century onwards, there are kind of more easily identifiable regional powers like Milan, especially that at this time is actually the most powerful city in Italy and in Europe, telling the truth, also the richest one. And had an amazing army, in fact, which is the one that effectively led the Lombard League victoriously against the Hohenstaufen. But it's important to stress once again the homogeneity of this military organization based on the city, right? Because if we were to talk about the Papal States, for example, they had a very different, at least, source of income and the way they employed. For example, mercenaries were much more common there than in other places. Why? Because the church had an enormous amount of money, but the church didn't coincide with the city of Rome, right? That actually was a commune on its own, even if the papacy was there. So this is typical of the political and juridical particularism of the Middle Ages, right? But just think that every city in this regard had its own army. So how did these troops serve practically? So there wasn't any permanent military service. Like the knights basically made up for it because they were always doing something in that regard. There was a seasonal rhythm of warfare especially in the 12th century. In the 13th, it goes basically as a sort of permanent state of warfare by many standards, and these places are very, very conflictual, especially when you see at the clash between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines in the 13th century. Many people say, they were just stupid because they fought for no reason. Well, those people were fighting essentially for the continental policy, right? There is a gross misunderstanding of what Guelphism and Ghibellinism actually was, right? It wasn't just the neighboring hatred that existed between two cities. Here we're talking about entire systems, including the Crown of France, the Holy Roman Empire, the Kingdom of Sicily, that gravitated around what happened in these single cities, including most important passages via sea, if you think about the maritime republics. But simply the access across the Alps, right, was of dramatic importance for the German emperors. So that's not about provincialism. That's not about, just these people were stupid because they fought each other instead than, doing something more productive. Because if you look at what they were doing in parallel to fighting each other, well, you find that the Renaissance was born accidentally, right? So this is yet another proof. If it, what we talk about in the von Clausewitz series didn't suffice, that actually civilization improves, controversially, also with the degree of destructive potential, right? And so it's not that evil people do war and, nice people don't do it, right? There are reasons for which wars are fought, and these have to be understood and not stigmatized a priori, like, if you fight, you're a barbarian. That's not history. That's not even remotely reason or logic, right? At the end of the day, however, in theory, every community, like in Italy, basically shared this military service system of Romano-Germanic origin, right, for which every freeman was called up to arms, right, potentially in times of need. Naturally, considered that military expenses were devastating. Like, of course, these communes were very rich, but they couldn't, like, fight every year major campaigns, right? Most of warfare was about raiding the enemy, the neighboring city cultivations and raising them, certain castles to the ground. Like, it didn't progress like that. But occasionally, naturally, the army was called up, and that, in theory, had to could comprehend all the resources of the city, right, that were theoretically extendable to all the able-bodied freemen, right? However, more usually, only a quarter or two of the city was sent to war, right? And this happened when a major battle was imminent. Like, as you know, major pitched battles in medieval warfare are relatively rare. Like, and this is true for Italy as well. But if you look actually at the incidents, some major clashes, also about which we don't know very much, that were, however, equally important for those who participated in it. This region of Europe was pretty active. And it also fielded, in fact, some of the largest armies in Europe from both sides. Sometimes you look at them, some of, as we will see now, even the numbers are very, very impressive. We're talking about thousands of cavalry and tens of thousands of infantry, right? These were usually coalitions, but, they're rare to find elsewhere, right? And usually also when there was the mass levy that involved not just the quarter but the countryside, we will see, there was still some unit, some company that remained in the city, right? I'm studying certain cases in which, just maybe some elderly remained, but the commune hired some mercenaries, or even they sent, they called troops from an allied city to guard the commune during the campaign. So this is all very interesting, and it varied according to the situation. It was nothing standardized in this regard. But we can observe, however, a certain cyclicity and continuity in this military organization that definitely reflects a prolonged effort over time that perfections itself, and you can see that military administration of the communes throughout this times accelerates, right, just as the economy and production, etc. So war is really, as always in this medieval context, the major expense, right, that represent major costs for the communities. 2 or 3 quarters often served at a time by the 12th century, and usually at least 1 quarter was left behind in the city to guard it, right, whatever the circumstances, because naturally, taking cities was also very rare. Like for a long time, you don't see many sieges of a city against another city, because usually it was such an enormous expense, right? Sieges being dramatically expensive, the most expensive operations in absolute terms by any standard, and also risky. But then usually the individual cities didn't carry these operations out, right? They tried usually to make the city rise, and a certain faction to prevail, and rather than bring an entire army for months around a city was an enormous expense, could ruin the finances of the single commune, right? But these things increase towards the 13th century anyway, and especially with coalition warfare that gets ever better articulated, organized, right? What is interesting of these cities is that their horizon is not provincial, it's regional, right? Especially towards the 13th century, these cities are in contact with every power out there in Europe. They know whatever thing is happening in the rest of Italy. They're in constant coordination with their allies, politically, militarily, and it was normal to exchange troops, like as much as in the 13th century the podestas were exchanged. I made a video recently about this topic. So troops were. So that explains also why these armies were so homogeneous by certain standards, because basically they were the same people, and the organizational forms were fundamentally the same. Now, looking at the organic of these armies, so as we've seen, the militia proper, that is the knights, fought with a regular, I would say, feudal organization. There were certain companies essentially that were composed of squadrons that were usually they were deployed in the front, because the battle was essentially fought among knights. As we were saying before, the infantry had largely a supportive role that becomes ever more important, but it was not supposed to resist cavalry charges alone, right? Without cavalry support. This would happen at Lignano, for example. The Lombard infantry resists, stubbornly against the charges of the imperial cavalry, and the cavalry that the same Lombard cavalry that had fled regrouped. Other reinforcements arrived, and that's how the battle was won. Also, the Battle of Cortenuovo, which the Lombards were defeated, but basically for the entire day, the Lombard infantry withstood the charges of the heavy imperial cavalry. And here we're talking about feudal culture from a military point of view. It's at the peak of its technical and moral strength. So here we're really, if you look at the forces that are involved in clashes like this, you realize how tough these infantries were at that time, and yet they retreated during the night, but still, the Imperials won. It was quite of a stand, and there were other cases later on in which you find even the Bolognese infantry, for example, at Fossalta, when King Heinz was the son of Frederick II, was captured eventually by the Bolognese. That when the Bolognese infantry knew that the cavalry of the King of Sardinia, of Heinz, was there, they basically crossed the river alone, without cavalry. Cavalries were still back, so that these infantrymen that went against heavy cavalry without caring even to have cavalry support, right? In Italy, as we were saying before, infantry would never make that extra leap that will happen with some other Europeans at the beginning of the 14th century, for which infantry could win alone an engagement against cavalry. Of course, if we talk about ambushes or other situations but in open field, that's wholly another story. So you never find that, but there are tons of hints that the infantry had reached a certain level of strength that was becoming really imposing, and that also was very articulated. And objectively here, it doesn't even make sense to talk about infantry alone, because you can't, an infantry wouldn't naturally have to be, they didn't have to prove anything to us today to measure their strength. If they had cavalry, they would use it. That's a clever thing to do. What you rather observe, and that's incidentally what I'm studying, is how much degree of coordination and tactical sophistication existed in these armies. And you realize that, and that included all the arms. It was a combined armed tactics, including cavalry and crossbowmen and stopping infantry, etc. And the degree of sophistication and organization, coordination of these armies is not to be found basically anywhere else, in my opinion, at that time, and possibly also beyond. Because that thing continued. I stopped at the 40s of the 14th century, and to me that's one of the most systematic, successful combinations I've ever seen on a battlefield at that time in history, right? And so the point of stopping cavalry is a problem that you get only when you lack cavalry, right? And that's the case of the Flemish against the French, right? Those cities largely didn't have much cavalry. They had it during the battle, but they weren't brigaded in a unit on their own to withstand the French cavalry. No, they took the French cavalry in the front, and they most of the times managed to stop it. So that's because they lacked it. Hence, they distinguished themselves for their strength as infantry. But if you have a city that can field actually a massive amount of cavalry, like it's the case in here, well, talking about the infantry performance is, if it's accidentally to be observed in the lack of cavalry, fine, but it was just not the norm. So the comparison could be also altered in this regard. And there is I actually spotted, and if I finish this damn thesis, I will see that there is a case, at least some sources, that say that crossbow fire managed alone, in certain cases, to prevent a cavalry charge. I found it in a battle in 1340, right? There is a source that is also fairly reliable, considerably reliable, that says this expressly. So Italy doesn't have these clamorous infantry victories, but it has some means that here really make you reflect a lot on whatever was going on here, that in fact is normally told as that then eventually in the 14th century cavalry regained pace in Italy, and infantry decline. It is true. It is true. We'll see it now. But at the same time, it's not true everywhere. And also, if you look at the strengths involved in the ratio cavalry infantry, you realize that all this great decline of infantry was relative, and especially was an increase in specialization that definitely had that reflected the decline of the lower strata of the population as mass infantry, but also an increase in the strength of certain specific bodies of infantry. But once again, this is something that should be contextualized better. Today we can't really do it, but it's there. But still, the infantry composition here, it's very important to look at, because as we've seen, cavalry was pretty standardly employed. Then there was all this massive infantry. It was very articulated and represents, in fact, the greatest level of organization in European infantries at this time. And here the thing is also usually poorly described, because we put all these specialist troops like archers, crossbowmen, spearmen, and pavisari, that is shield bearers, these pavises that are usually employed to protect the crossbowmen. Then the so-called guastatori, they were the sappers, like they were pioneers. If you look at, especially as in all medieval warfare, you realize there was a big deal of field fortifications in here. And Italy especially was dotted basically with castles literally everywhere. Like every city district had tents, and it is not true that, for example, open areas like the Po Valley were, the ideal for cavalry, because it was full of rivers and rivers and rivers and trenches and castles and stuff like that. And that's the realm of infantry, in fact, that has a greater tactical value, albeit this decreases its absolute value because it's backed by fortifications. But once again, what's the absolute value in a military context? There is not. And if you look at what these pioneers and sappers could mount up from a logistical point of view, it was amazing, right? Especially those fortifications that were built around besieged cities or castles. There were massive structures. Like there are contemporary observers that were also involved in building city walls and things like that on behalf of the Commune. They which read ancient sources and said, objectively, Caesar's fortifications at Alesia were less than this, right? Watching what this guys were able to build, and I've been studying that too, and I must say it is very reliable as a statement. These were immense works of fortification. Sometimes they remain even after the siege was over, because even some castles or other forts were founded like that. We're not talking about the city themselves, right? The cities were built in usually the major buildings in stone, and the walls naturally in stones, but there were every kind of fortification. It was this house towers we mentioned before were massive. If you look at a communal center in this centuries, it was like there were tens and tens of house towers, tens and tens of meters tall, like old skyscrapers, and that those were primarily conceived for a military function, right? They mounted trebuchets on them. They bombarded people with stones and crossbow bolts. It was a mess. Like usually the main clash in the city would happen in the square where troops could be deployed more easily. And they were very violent clashes. But the intrinsic defensive capability of these structures was very high. Like all in the rest of Europe, telling the truth. But this was brought Italy still has a very, I think, the highest population density in Europe. So there are in fact many spaces, because there is the Apennine throughout all the way. So Tuscany is a hilly ground, Lombardy as a flat ground, and where most of communal civilization developed. And you realized the city, just a city in itself, was an enormous thing to, strategically speaking, to overcome, right? And that's why it was that difficult to even conquer these places. They tried, Frederick I, Frederick II, to destroy a city like Milan. That was the largest, most powerful. The Milanese, they had their city razed to the ground. In a few years, they rebuilt it from scratch. Now, I don't know, we're talking about the 12th century. Do you realize how many resources these people had? It was incredible. So even you can crush a city, it will regrow, and there are still tens of cities that are standing there. Naturally, half of them stands from the side of the emperor, but the other half already is enough to be, even if, backed by the papacy, backed by the French, or whatever, even by the Byzantines sometimes. But, where do you find the money to do that? And it's incredible that even, the result, this highlights actually even value of individuals like Frederick Barbarossa that had the strength to try to curb them and to obtain some result in that regard, but it was too much, right? Especially when the other, even the Ghibellines, saw what the aim of Barbarossa was, that is essentially to destine all the income of the whole kingdom to the emperor. They said, wait a moment, what are we doing this for? And they passed, in fact, to the Ghibelline side, and that's how they lost in the end. But just for saying how, the balance naturally was more complicated in this, but there were other factors and other levels in which you could play, but just from an infrastructural point of view, it was a massive work. So talking about the technical specialization of these infantries, so there were other, well, okay, talking about archers, well, archery in Italy wasn't that developed for the simple reason that the crossbow took over quite quickly. And this myth that archery is better than the crossbows is a myth, actually. And no, the 100 Years' War doesn't prove that, right? There are so many other factors nobody considers. I don't even know how people like simply to say that there is a weapon that can solve all the problems, because it doesn't exist, and it's just not clever to deal with military history in this regard. But a crossbow in this regard had, Italy was on the vanguard together with northern France for military technology in Europe. Especially Lombardy pioneered trebuchet warfare, crossbows, right? It was an area that had a great technical development, great even scientific interest, and high levels of literacy, as we've seen. So it was a great commitment in general in this. In these inventions, and the crossbow at one point becomes basically the standard missile weapon. Like, there were smaller units of archers that you can still find in the 13th century, but numerically speaking, they weren't comparable to the crossbows, the crossbowmen, and you can easily see that the crossbow is also developed as an anti-cavalry weapon. Like, it's a weapon of the people per excellence. These crossbowmen were usually deployed at the flanks of cavalry, right? So that the two enemy cavalries would fight to this corridor, and from the flanks, this crossbowmen would shoot at the enemy cavalry or at each other, right? Hence the need, and consider that cavalry was largely the horses proper were largely unarmored at this point. They had things like gambeson. Towards the 13th century, we find even coat of mail for horses, but we're talking about, gambeson is effective, doesn't stop everything. Nor chainmail does, but chainmail, at least at that point, is together with gambeson, so it's so costly that just a very tiny elite of troops would have it. Usually those, in fact, that had to break through the enemy lines. We'll see it better when talking about cavalry. Hence the need to use Pavises, right? Now, the story of the Pavises is very interesting. I'm studying it thoroughly because, paradoxically, it appears fairly late in time. The history of Pavises is fascinating because, as far as we know, first of all, we have no idea how they were in the 13th century. Like, we're full of Pavises for later times, and we see that they were iconically used. Either the crossbowmen wore them on their back, and therefore they turned while reloading, or they were used also by infantry to form these shield walls, and so on. But the truth being that there are two regions of Europe where the Pavises emerge that are very strangely different in this regard. One is Italy, one is Lithuania. We discussed about this in those videos dedicated to Lithuanian warfare, and no, they don't have anything common as an origin, right? Different, Eastern Europe in general had its own tradition of shields that brought to that time to be developed. The Italians were dealing with other tactical problems. They developed them in parallel. Actually, the Lithuanians developed them before the Italians in the first decades of the 13th century, and the Italians in the mid 13th century, but there is no correlation between the two things. There were not many ways you can make a shield in the first place, so the actual difference in these shields was, as far as we can understand, and as also the etymology of the name says, is they were layered. Like, Pavis has the same etymology of pavement, right? It's this straight out, thicker wood, as far as we understand. The problem is that we know practically nothing of how they were, because we don't have archaeological finds from that time. And the stereotype, the cliches, that the Pavis was a sort of camping table fixed on the ground to either during sieges but also in battle, was so large and covered everything, right? This is actually not true either, right? I think that there were things like that. They were definitely used, like the other even mobile field fortifications and stuff like that. There were all kinds essentially, but actually the only reliable information about the sizes of Pavises comes from an order, a commission of Charles of Anjou in Naples when the Angevins had seized the kingdom of Sicily. And I don't remember, there was a connection with Genoa, because most of the Angevin fleet was Genoese, as a matter of fact, as Guelphs. And we have the order exactly of the dimensions of these shields, and it turns out these Pavises were actually small, right? I mean, or at least they were average shields. Like, they didn't have that big idea with. This stuff was destined for naval troops, for marines, so we don't actually know either how much they could differ, but it's obvious that the Pavise in itself, at this time there were no scientific categories even in the vocabulary. So the Pavise, according to me, is just a name that stresses how thick this thing was, right? And that's what made difference. The sizes could, they could have many different sizes. There could be big camping tables, like as much as the Pavisotti, for example, were used by cavalry even. There were small, smaller shields. The point, though, is that, as far as I'm understood, these wings of crossbowmen on the flanks of cavalry were protected by frontal infantry that had pikes and Pavises together, I think, because we know from certain chronicles, certain sources, that Pavise men were also pikemen, right? The Pavise could also be hanged on the shoulder, right, like a bit in the Macedonian phalanx style, more or less like that. And those were the guys who were stationed in front of these wings, so that the enemy cavalry wouldn't try to go against these walls, and would keep just fighting each other, while the crossbowmen would shoot over the heads of these guys and try to hit the also at a certain distance in the back, and trying to hit the cavalry in the center. There is an enormous discussion about this issue, and that's why I'm writing a 1,000 pages thesis on it, right? Because if you look, for example, all these modeling, dioramas and things like that, you see that there is the idea that the Pavise men and the pikemen and the crossbowmen were essentially a trio fighting together in a kind of small tactical unit, like literally close to each other, like the Pavise men holding the shield and the pikemen in front of the shield. Behind the shield, but the pikes, going through over the shield and in the front, and then the crossbowman at his side. And in my opinion, it was completely different. Like a line like that couldn't hold cavalry by itself, and also the. We know, as a matter of fact, from certain now I can't discuss it in detail, but for certain numbers and how troops were disposed, etc., that these were actually three different types of units that were divided from one another. They usually fought close to each other, right, but still layered in three different ranks. And also there were other troops equipped with blunt weapons or pole arms that I think, just like you find, for example, in the battles of Scotland versus England, Flanders versus France, there was the hedgehog of pikemen, and then there would be these small units of either usually was the double hand axe for the Scots and the Godendag for the Flemish, that would run out of the ranks when a cavalryman was knocked down in front of them. It would essentially finish him off with these blunt weapons, and the Italians had this stuff too. And so this is the standard type of interaction on the field as far as I've studied it. And the other troops would be these were the wings. Then basically behind the cavalry in the center was the bulk of the rest of the infantry. Like, it was usually lighter infantry, but they weren't specialists. That was the large amount of the people. They're usually the baggage in the rear, as always, and also in front of the main ranks of cavalry. There could be multiple, right, different units. There was a frontal one that was known as the feditori. That was the etymology being literally those who pierced through, because they were a picked body of knights that had this basically suicidal task of launching themselves against the enemy ranks, cavalry ranks, and breaking through. And sometimes they made it, right? Very, very interesting battles we'll have to tell in this story. That usually they were chopped down by the guys who were in the posterior ranks of the other lines of cavalry. But in the meanwhile, you had knocked out an entire line. That was a big deal. And all battles were fought essentially like this, and there was an increased specialization, especially towards the late 13th century, where this specific type of warfare in Italy had fully developed and sophisticated itself, where this was more or less the standard in the main pitch battles, right? And there is, once again, a huge discussion about it, but once again, I think this is how they actually worked. And in the interesting thing about this system is that I don't know it in any other army in Europe at this time. And that's why it's so interesting. And I think that actually Italian warfare, albeit not drawing attention because it didn't have an infantry victory, actually displays certain characteristics that you don't find elsewhere, and that justify the way of warfare in their own way. So that's quite fascinating, and I will not spend myself now in other considerations. Just knowing that the pikemen did exist. Many of you will probably criticize, say, oh, well, pikemen weren't here at the point, that was a Swiss. No. Pikes exist since prehistory, and all armies, historically speaking, have used pikes. What is a pike? The pike is just a lance that is longer than the usual. That's literally the only definition you can find in any military manual. Pikemen did exist, and if you look, in fact, at Flemish armies, Scottish armies, they used these weapons. But they weren't majority like it would happen with the Swiss. This is true in the mid-15th century. The problem is that these infantries weren't professional like the Swiss of the mid-15th century, so that even the Swiss of the early 14th century had a minority proportion of pikes, and they had usually the vogue, right? And halberds and stuff like that, contrarily to popular interpretation, halberds are not an effective anti-cavalry weapon by any standard. But by any standard meaning, that for stopping cavalry charges effectively, pikes are, right? And the problem is not here what kind of weapon you use, as I often say, but how much you want to rip your enemy's guts. That makes the difference on the field, and that's how the Flemish won the French cavalry. The flower of European cavalry was slaughtered at Courtrai, or Courtrai if you prefer. Not because the Flemish were hyper sophisticated at all. There were just a lot of people concentrated in a space, layer shielded by stream and ditches, and they held because they had a lot of guts. They didn't know what was a weapon because they had never used, but they were so motivated they made it. It's literally what happened. So always remember it. By Clausewitzian standard, warfare is a clash between moral forces. Weapons by themselves are just an adaptation to tactics, not the other way around. I say this because we were talking about the comparison longbow, crossbow before. Once again, it's not true inherently that the longbow has an absolute superiority over the crossbow. It's not true. First and foremost, it has a shorter range. So already this could suffice to say, okay, doesn't matter how fast you throw, that's a problem how you employ these troops and how the enemy does. And there's nothing to kid about how, certain armies fought and died, right? The French were not a bunch of morons that went themselves to be slaughtered at every battle against the English because they were stupid. Just a stupid person would believe that, right? And a person who doesn't know what attrition or the fog of war is. But aside from that, I mentioned the longbow because the Italian pike this type was known, in fact, as long spear. Right. This is interesting because there is a sort of parallelism in the vocabulary in this regard, because it literally was known as lancia lunga. Right. It had also other names like jalda, and very often also from the terminology we don't understand clearly what it was, meaning that there's a bit of mystery that surrounds these weapons, because we don't have a full explicitation of their interaction. Like we know a lot of things from the battles, but nobody has really thoroughly looked into those things yet, and that's what I want to fit in. And sometimes these pikemen were used also in the range of thousands. If you look at Florentine army in the first, it was in the 10s and the 20s of the 14th century, you see they had like thousands of them. So at that point, it's not a specialistic weapon. It's something different. Many other armies had it in Italy. It was probably standard. It was universal. The problem is that in order to make pikes work well, they have to be many, and it takes a lot of cohesion and training, which is before the Swiss. Europeans generally wouldn't have. But if you were to determine which was the closest to that, probably it is the second half of the 13th and the first half of say first decades of 14th century Italy, possibly even more than armies like the Scottish ones, for example, because those weren't all pikemen. But it would be the Scots are the best eligible as a parallel. But I've read extensively about this, that military history from De Vries that has made a PhD thesis on that stuff, and I don't see what I see elsewhere. Like there is a stronger cohesion, no doubt. Like the Italians will not reach that, but in terms of employment of scientifically, I mean, I don't know how to say that. Doctrinally, it's also an anachronistic term, but it can't fit. Employed pikemen for a specific use that wasn't central because they were deployed on the wings. The Italians made the most improved use of them in mid 15th century times, in my opinion. Right then, I have to write the chapter in which I make this comparison about between these different nations. But the interesting is that still the long spear, the pike, in this Italian context doesn't, at least I've read, I'm a bit skeptical on it, but the specialists about weapons say that it wasn't longer because like the spear had lengthened from previous times, but because cavalry spears had shortened over time, which is something kind of strange, but I mean, it's possible. And I've seen also cases in which objectively, cavalry charged into these pikemen and got butchered down, right? Even if they were in radical inferior, like numerical inferiority. But that's, let's say, another story. In general, however, the important is when you look at these tactics is that you don't have to think it was necessarily applicated all the times. Like they were much more systemic than probably what historiography has believed, but at the same time, at least we're not able to see them always, right? And there are also varying proportions in which they were employed. We have certain armies, as we've seen, that were in the thousands, others in which you had thousands of infantry and just a few hundreds of these pikemen, so you don't really understand how they were used. And seemingly there were certain variants. At least one source says that there were one of them was used by the sappers as well. So that's quite strange because we have literally the palest idea what the hell that meant, for example. And this was the general tactics, and that's what infantry. So all this package of infantry basically was still in a subordinated function to cavalry. That was the protagonist still of the field. So the units were. So first of all, these infantry units had all their own flags. They had all the different troop types of each quarter, right? Wearing them, there were the guilds, the craftsmen all had their own, these professional associations, etc. And what is interesting also is that were officered by citizens salaried on a full-time basis, but serving only in wartime. That is to say, I don't know, you were a normal civilian, but you knew that in wartime you had to, essentially, you were paid to guide your troops and to deploy them. And these were people who had matured evenly over the years a certain military experience in the service of the Commune. There is also a great historiographical debate on how much training existed in these communities, because we have also not quite a clear idea about it. There were certain small battles that were part of city games that indeed could vary from, kids throwing stones at each other to, serious battles, right, with full panoply of troops in which that they weren't even just, they happened in festivals, but sometimes the public authority had troubles to contain them because these people really killed each other, right? All these internal feuds among the clans, etc. This thing kind of happened. Infantry obviously needed a minimal training to be in the field and to be, to maneuver. There wasn't much of maneuvering. Like most, the infantry wasn't conceived to do that, right? They had to stay fixed and to withstand the eventual attack of the cavalry, and essentially to offend at a distance with missile weapons. But still, they had to be deployed. They had to maintain a certain order. So, a necessary pre-existing training was there by certain standards. It's just we don't realize how this was exactly performed all the time. Then the subunits. So usually there were the troops that corresponded to a company in size, so a few hundred men under a banner. Then there were the flags. There were smaller chunks, and then smaller units like platoons of 25 men. They were called XII-XIII, in fact, because that's what 25 in Italian. And these XII-XIII are actually interesting because there's some better documented communes, such as Bologna, for example, have recorded in their communal administration the various men that had to participate to these units. So we know something about the organization. Unfortunately, this is just on paper. Like on the statutes, we know about the recruitment laws and how these people had to go to war naturally based on census. People who had a certain amount of money had to have a certain level of armor, the usual story. But we don't know how these armies were composed, like exactly. I'm a great supporter of the idea that we can get this from the chronicles that are actually that Italy produced an astonishing amount of chronicles at this point. Like no other country ever produced anything like that up to that point. And if you confrontate them, they're actually dramatically homogeneous. And it's astonishing because they're narrative sources. So the best thing we have condotta contracts, for example, that just tell you about, maybe a company was hired. Maybe there were just 30 knights. What the hell do we know in an army of, hundreds of cavalrymen, tens of infantry? What was the point, right? We understand that it was just a small company, and it was brigaded along in the line of cavalry in battle, but that's it. And the only source that we have actually about the composition of not just of an Italian but of a European army in medieval times is the famous book of Montaperti. Montaperti was a battle in 1260 that was put an end to the Ghibelline hegemony in Tuscany, in which the Siennese basically crushed the Florentine army. So Florence was a big city already at the time, and it had its own military administration. Basically, the Siennese, when they stormed the Florentine camp after the battle, they they think these camps had everything, like all the quarter, like all the administrative stuff, all the soldiers that were, there was a very intense control on troops on the battlefield. Desertions naturally existed in any army at the time, and there were communal officials that kept these books where they asked how many people were there, why they weren't there, because they were ill, because they were old. It's very interesting. Maybe one day we can make a video on that. And this book is the only thing that we have that kind for all European history, and it's incredible because it was found basically back by the Florentines in the 15th century when they occupied Siena. Finally, think about the revenge of Monteferti in that regard, but they had been allies in previous times, though, and they saved the original. So we actually have it. It was transcribed by the Florentines, and we have it. But that's the only thing that tells us what an army of the time was like in its actual composition. We have nothing on that level of precision for the time, unfortunately. So, as we've said before, all able-bodied freemen between the ages of 14 and 70, in some cases 18 and 60, were obliged to perform the military service for the Commune. Even though only, let's say, the citizens served, in the sense that, the long-staying residents or possessors of land or cash within the city were the true bulk, especially at the beginning of this period, of the communal strength, right? And service was personal. That is, every person was, mastered as, individually. But it was possible to send someone else in your place, in your stead. This is interesting because this is also, you can trace the decline of military service in communal Italy towards the end of the period, so that the Commune would simply pay for ever more mercenaries, because these people in the city had gentrified. They were becoming rich merchants. They didn't want to fight anymore. They even had lost in part the military character, but more than else the motive, the moral interest to go fighting. Then there were other ways of, for example, there was political discrimination. Like if you were a Ghibelline in a Guelph city, you were tended to be excluded because they thought that you could betray in the battle, which happened. The Battle of Monteferti was fought exactly like that. There were betrayers in the Florentine city that Florentine army that began to fight within the Florentine army during the Sienese onslaught, and there were other forms of military service that included naturally the manning of city walls during sieges, but also for regular guards, the town watch, the city watch of the walls. Walls at this point are growing, like the Italian cities are expanding. Usually the center was the ancient Roman city sometimes with the same walls. Then there were all these suburbs of people who went working in the city. So the city at one point builds another city wall around this, and it expands, especially towards the 13th century. So it means that these walls must be upkept and guarded, and that was quite a big expense for the Commune after all. And however, from the early 12th century at the very latest, and this is very, very early actually, all these troops were salaried in the army, like in the sense they were paid for their performance, usually. So this naturally makes you understand how, these were the citizens specifically, how, demanding also this thing was for the collectivity, right? That's where we pass, in fact, once again to the knights, because that's the key really of many political upheavals also in later times. Because if you look at by the mid-12th century, but probably also earlier, all those who could afford a horse were obliged to serve as cavalry. And the knights of the city nobility inevitably supplied most of this category. albeit many non-noble citizens also served on horseback, right? As we were saying before, the the militia was quite inclusive, right? It was a sensual matter. As long as you were enough rich to serve on horseback, it was actually a great thing for you, because you could enter in the ruling class and to share the profits in all of this. And these knights were known as altogether as the milites pro commune. That means the knights of the commune, or in favor of the commune, that have certain parallels in other areas where you find urbanized noblemen. For example, there are the caballeros villanos in Spain that are kind of similar, and these milites had actually a lot of privileges, as we were saying before. This is very interesting because the idea back in the day was that if you were a freeman, this was the Roman and a Germanic tradition, that you had the duty but the privilege at the same time to fight for the community, which means that theoretically you should have not even be paid for it. Naturally, this in every advanced society tends to be false, because these people needed to be paid, and the way they were paid also wasn't just a matter of these people wanted to be compensated. It's literally that when you have such large communities, someone must take care of logistics. So you can't, let this being organized by the individual people. The commune acted like a state, would supply the troops with weapons, equipment, right, all this stuff. So there was an increase in monetization, of course. Also partial, we can say, uniformity of the armament, because it's too far from that. But I mean, the idea is that the commune had weapons depots, and they especially maintained the things like catapults, like or trebuchets in the communal palace. Yes, especially the beams that were the most difficult thing to build, and were kind of expensive. But here there is a counter sense to the ideally republican values of these communities that you can find ironically also in ancient Rome. That is, that the equites, equo publico, right, were essentially knights that were not just serving because they were rich enough, but that they were also they were paid properly by the state for their service, like in addition to the other pay that was normally due at this point to who wanted to fight, which is a kind of anti-democratic thing, because if you think about it, it's like everybody participates to the army, but here the nobility on horseback gets compensated while other people don't. For example, for the losses, if the horse got crippled, which was dramatically frequent, there was a lot of corruption and scams in this regard, because opposite communal officials that were entrusted with the task to control whether these guys maybe crippled their horses on purpose during a campaign to get the money for compensation. It was a big business revolving around this stuff, right? So once a horse had been purchased to fulfill the military obligation, it was maintained by the commune, by whom it was replaced if killed or on active service, right? And such cavalry service was hereditary. It was a privilege, as we've seen, though the obligation could be, and often was, fragmented amongst a number of coheirs, who then owed the service of a cavalry between them. It was also common, because remember that these guys also came from clans, so it was actually the extended family that also invested in this stuff and shared the benefits. And a lot of cavalry was fielded at this point, which also proves how many people in these cities were actually rich. For example, as many as 2/3 of the Florentine cavalry fielded at Montaperti in 1260 were provided by this means of the milites pro commune. Noblemen were obliged to supply the city's podestà with a full list of their military retinues, being personally responsible for their actions in peace as well as war. Now, the podestà, if you remember, was this foreign, meaning it was actually still Italian, but outside the city was considered a foreigner. That it was called chiefly for pacifying, especially at the beginning of the 13th century, where things were starting being trouble in the cities, the factions, right? And he was also a military specialist. Like he had a task force of lawyers and other people who had to effectively govern the city in full respect of the communal constitutions. But chiefly he was called now because of his military expertise, right? These were literally families of military professionals who basically had this convention with a specific city, usually in another, even in a distant area of Italy, and that were to keep, in fact, they were involved in strategic choice. I mean, usually it was the city council determining certain things, but the Podestà had a consistent power. And the Podestas were initially called chiefly by the people because they started to distrust the noblemen, etc. So as in those cases where the people were strong enough, the Podestà could require to these magnates essentially to provide their private troops. That is, troops that they owned literally privately, and that they didn't have to pay for the military service, in the sense that, if I'm rich enough, I mean, there were people who were very, very rich, the magnates, that in this sense the people did fear, because they thought they would transform themselves into lords, as it was starting to happen at this time, that had lots of castles in the city, I mean, house towers in the city, castles in the countryside. So individually, their clans had to provide, 30 knights, let's say, to the city army, but at the same time were so rich they had extra money for hiring other troops, right? They were maybe vassals of the countryside, or simply mercenaries, or their other retinues, right? And it was full of these troops, and it's kind of typical, right, that the magnate had especially this rural contingents at their service, and therefore there was a kind of a public check on this by by controlling these guys in this way. And they naturally, weren't quite happy of it, and that's where things started also to get messed up. So another big part of this picture was naturally represented by the countryside, right? Every Italian city had a city district that was essentially the ancient Roman district, and later diocese, later county in Carolingian, post-Carolingian times. That the city was usually, the city was essentially the greatest authority there. Usually the cities had been governed in pre-communal times, especially in Ottonian times, by the bishops, right, that had the diocese overlapping the district, the county, right? And the county hence was in Latin the comitatus. So in Italian this evolved in contado, right? Hence contadini, that means peasants, right? Because they were the comitatini, literally, in Latin. So the people inhabiting this district, and they were the rurals, right? As we were saying before, there were other communes in the contado, right? There were rural communes, for example. Some of them, they would evolve, even becoming towns at some point. And they had their own military organization, which is very interesting. And these rural districts were called up to, to make part of the, to the communal army, let's put it in this way, even though they were separated from the rest of the city. Like, these people were, it's as if they had been literally part of another commune, right? But it's like feudalism, right? There are various powers, a stronger power than the others serve in their behalf, right? And alongside with them. And the Italian countryside was very rich as well, partly even literate, and it also was, differently from certain regions in northern France or Germany, for example, dramatically intertwined, like it connected with the city. Like the Italian countryside never had like this world of the forest was like a thing on its own out there in medieval time. No, the city had always remained the center of everything, everywhere. So it's natural that the same peasants had this, relative interest in, at least in theory, especially in case of invasion, things like that, to stick for side of the commune. Consider also that the wealth of the commune literally depended on the district. Like that's what in pre-industrial times you find everywhere. Like there is no city without a countryside. The countryside comes before the city in economical terms. And naturally, these were very fertile areas. They had, as you're saying, specialized productions, agriculture, cattle, very, very advanced agricultural systems already at this point. So it was a big asset. And if you think about this strategically, where you have all these communes basically separated only by a few tenths of kilometers, you realize that it's always a kind of a emergential state at the end of the day, because the enemy can attack you very quickly from many directions, and destroying valuable assets. Like there's these major raids, in fact, on the enemy countryside that were aimed at starving the city, because that's what the enemy. You devastate the countryside, hence they stop having supplies, and it goes on like that as a war of attrition. Actually, that goes on over and over, right? And at a certain point, certain cities collapse. Like if you wonder why, the Hohenstaufen were called in Lombardy to go there fight. Because Milan had started swallowing, the neighbors, and these cities were quite upset. They called the emperor, right, to intervene, and that's how it started in a nutshell. So there were certain communes here that were doing something that, as we were saying before, was monstrous for the time standards in terms of political and institutional norms, because they weren't doing it without any legitimate, juridical foundation of any kind. They were simply doing it because they were powerful enough to do it. So in the feudal hierarchy, where at the top was the emperor, this was considered as inconceivable, but they did it, and they kept doing it. And interestingly enough, the numerical bulk of the communal armies was actually made up of peasants. Like the infantry, the city infantry naturally had very effective, had the cream of the infantry, right? Also because we know it, like the cities were extremely rich. They were full of equipment, like they were full of privately held stocks of weapons, right? So we know that when, for example, there were city battles, you find something very interesting, that some sources say that these people were actually equipped as if they were knights. Like they were commoners, but having enough armor weaponry to actually fight as knights. This is very interesting because there is one Florentine chronicle, when talking about the Flemish revolts against the French, says that the Flemish citizens did something very similar to that. They were, equipped with this heavy armor, right? So that's also literally a matter of material wealth of communes, like the Italian ones or the ones in the Flanders, right? That are literally about this. They're per capita disgustingly rich, right? Also, naturally, they didn't all live in wealth, so there was always someone who held most of this power, but it was distributed when in time of need, when you needed arms to fight, right? So the various, so within the city district there were smaller districts, and these were called to participate to the army. There was a vicariate that determined the tax assessment. Some of the district, this could be very considerable. For example, Florence had 8,000 contadini in arms in 1260, 4,000 in 1302, and 12,000 in 1312, right? Siena fielded 3,000 in 1292 and 7,000 in 1318, right? And by the 13th century, you can see that every city quarter had usually a contingent of contadini attached to in wartime, right? So that these were usually the peasants who worked in the section of the district where the citizens had their properties from that side of the gates, right? And usually these troops were lighter, as you can imagine. They were poorer people. They worked sometimes as guazzatori, for example, as sappers. And they were effective as workforce in general. Some of them were instead equipped by the Commune itself, right? So that there was this attempt, especially by the most populous contadi, the communes with the most populous contadi, to start levying massive armies of peasants. That it didn't turn very well, right? Florence, for example, had armed 3,000 peasants in 1260, but just with, actually hadn't armed them, like they just fought with scythe or hoe, right? Later on, actually, they would be provided even with pikes, as we've seen before, but the cohesion was definitely lower. And this was a problem, because the idea was, like, the citizens becoming richer and they didn't want to die anymore in war, and therefore levying these peasants that, historically had been conquered by the Commune and were being oppressed and squeezed and whatever. So, it's not just such a great idea, right? And that's something that if you read, even in the Renaissance, in the 16th century, Machiavelli writing, ideally, what he's thinking of his army of state, of citizens. But if you look at what the citizens are, they're actually the peasants. They're not the Florentines proper, right? It's pretty weird. And this explains also why the best option at the end of this period was to levy, as we will see now, also an increasing amount of mercenaries, because the cities were enormously wealthy, but that's exactly for that gentrification that the people didn't want to go to war anymore. And it kind of makes sense also because the mercenary experience wasn't at all something a negative in Italy as it's usually depicted, right? It actually did work, like, even if the mercenaries eventually, in some cases betrayed and they were definitely not particularly attached to the city, but they still performed well, and it's not that necessarily citizen army would have done better, right? And that was exactly the point why they had called them. And no, don't mention me the mid of 14th century, because the soldiers of fortune took over in certain cases, but if you look at the world picture, the communes remained in charge of the whole situation and were even able to wipe them out in the end of the day, so that Italy wasn't taken over by the mercenaries. It didn't happen like that. On the contrary, there was an increasing, tightening on control on these troops in an ever more effective way up to look at the 15th century, that the cities had some of the most advanced military systems around. And other powers like France or Burgundy were fundamentally working along the same lines. So it was not such a dramatic moment as it's usually depicted for some historiographical reasons that we can't take rest in. So, and the peasants were also paid less, naturally, than the citizen army. And generally, however, these masses were also brigaded separately, right? The idea was, they are the expendable mass, but at the same time you can't rely on them very much. And in addition to this, naturally, the contado was used for supplies of weapons, horses, etc. So you can see that the wealth progressively of these countrysides being literally sucked away, right, by war, and this is also what brought to the creation of the regional states, because basically there was just one city was more powerful than the other, managed to make collapse the other and to occupy them, right, and demilitarize them, and just to take the revenues, hence more money for the mercenaries. That's how it happened, right? That's how there is a sort of compaction of the political picture of the later times. So the command of the communal army was entrusted to the podestà, usually before this type of regime to the consuls, as we've seen before, or sometimes also the captains of the people. I mean, sometimes the captain of the people was an institution we'll see now that was developed later on, but usually the headquarters, the communal army would see all this, like, the main officer, the podesta usually, but the captains of the people as well, and then the major noblemen of the city. So it was a bit of a variegated group, right? From the early 12th century, one or more of a town's elected consuls, the number varying from town to town and year to year, might also be found in command of militia detachments, right? So there were people deputed to that specifically in the absence of a more professional figure. In one instance recorded in 1175, as few as 225 knights were commanded by two such consuls, right? So this also shows a kind of a political control also on these figures, not to make them seize too much power, right, which is natural. And captains and consuls could include both greater feudal nobility, right, so, or also the capitani, the captains of the people, and the valvassores, that were these, especially in Lombardy and in Milan specifically, were these like kind of a relic of feudal class in some way that had maintained more equilibrated, as well as the common citizens. This is especially in Tuscany. I mean, the main difference you have to think about here is that the Lombard infantry, the Lombard armies basically emerged better, like earlier, and than all the rest of Italy, and yet more slowly. So basically, there is a social stratification that brings to the a bit of a balance between the people, the church, and the noblemen, right? And it remains more or less like that up to the rise of the signories. Instead, in Tuscany, you had, a later military organization, later development, say better, but much quicker, in which basically the lower strata of the population rose dramatically because they made a lot of money with banking and basically financing the crusades of Charles of Anjou against Manfred of Sicily, so that they were repaid with monopolies in the Sicilian grain and things like that. So you see a much more popular strength, and in fact also the harsh, largely the harsh, on average the harshest anti-magnate laws, right? So that the people took over much more quickly, and definitely in certain cases, so much that in Florence fundamentally would remain at in charge till the end of the Republic, properly meant with the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. So when we talk about numbers of these armies, as I was saying before, we see large numbers, right? Milan is by far at this point the strongest city, right? It's the largest and richest city in Europe. I stress this, right? And claimed that it could field 40,000 infantry, with another 30,000 men available from the 600 villages in her contado. And this is a bit of an exaggeration, but it's at least on paper effectively the theoretical strength, if they had had the means to levy all the free able-bodied men at once, right? And yeah, it does correspond to that. We see that they could levy effectively tens of thousands of troops. And also they had mercenaries relatively early at their dependence, right? In the 12th century, which kind of an early date, 2,000 men at arms, right? Matthew Paris writes that in 1237, quote, a creditable Italian asserted that Milan, with its dependencies, raised an army of 6,000 men at arms, and all allegedly equipped with horse armor, and that this figure had increased to 10,000 by 1288. This is an exaggeration as well, right? But don't think that, 6,000 men at arms by 1237 maybe it's too much, but it's not that far from reality. Definitely by the end of the 13th century, yeah, 6,000 men-at-arms was feasible, but always theoretically on paper, right? You must have the political force to rise the troops, also rather than just economical, by the way. But yes, they had this kind of pool of recruitment. I mean, for real, they had, easily the major cities in Italy at this point could raise thousands of cavalry and tens of thousands of infantry. We're talking about cities, right? This is normally a kingdom's army by medieval standards, and also of that time, of course. Exaggerations are to be found, but once again, if you look at if you cherry pick the exaggerations, you think that these sources are not reliable. Generally speaking, they are very reliable, especially if you look at chronicles, right? And this is the norm. Usually, armies, the armies that were levied on average were hundreds of cavalrymen and thousands of infantry, but we're talking about smaller strategical tasks, like, for example, seizing a castle, on the frontier of the district. It's not the full commitment of the city, right? We can find easily very large numbers of troops, and also reasoning in terms like, how much a single city can raise is, especially towards the moment of greatest power of these cities, also from an individual point of view, not very sensible, because essentially at this time coalition warfare is taking place, and coalition warfare brings even more men on the table, right? If you look at battle the early 14th century, you can find as many as 2,000, 3,000 cavalrymen and 30,000 infantry, and I'm not kidding. These are not exaggerations, right? So once again, just kingdoms usually and rarely actually manage to field such numbers, right? And this is amazing, and frankly, I don't realize why there is not such a great interest toward this era of Europe for medieval warfare, because it's of dramatic importance and also of terrific documentation. Like, this is literally, as we were saying before, the best documented land in Europe throughout all the Middle Ages. So there is no way you can escape this if you want to know what warfare was at the time in general. So yeah, there are kind of different examples that there were. I'm personally studying, in the first chapter of Pavises, I'm writing this kind of comparison, in fact, about the numerical strengths of these cities, and you can notice that there were certain cities that were, like, for example, they had a very populous district, so they had lots of infantry, but for example a fewer cavalry. This is typical especially of the poorer regions, also the Alpine districts, the ones of the Apennines. It was very interesting because you would think that cavalry would be stronger actually in areas that were less urbanized, right? It's not the case, but we should say that feudalism has survived chiefly in the Apennine, right? Also in the seigneuries of Piedmont, a bit of northeastern Italy. So you can find a sounder feudal culture in there. If you take, for example, Friuli in the northeast of Italy, that's a land that has consistently much in common with Germany than Italy by certain standards. Not more, but it's still, you see this word of frontier, right? Where Germany at this point is a completely feudal, military culture in many ways. Especially by the 13th century, the 14th century. So you can look at these influences, right? And naturally, if you look at the south of Italy, especially under the Angevins, the Swabians, those definitely are feudal armies, right? They have infantry. There was surely communal infantry from the southern cities, but still the core is the one of a feudal culture. At the same time, however, as we were saying before, and this is important to stress, don't think that the numbers were so like that. The Italian communal armies were more about infantry, so there was something essentially different from other armies in Europe. It's not really so. Like, they were exactly the same troops, right? An Italian knight at this point is identical to a French knight or a German knight. I mean, they literally use the same weapons. They have the same lifestyle, the same training, right? I think that certain areas of Europe, especially Germany, were more militarized, and they had a stronger, they placed more emphasis, for example, on cavalry charges. This is very fascinating. I'm studying this as well. But the essence, aside from, these are shades essentially of a body that, Europe, that was very, very standard in many ways. I mean, if you look from Portugal to Poland, from Norway to Sicily, well, the knight is essentially the same thing, right? You can find slight average differences, like, I don't know, in the Iberian Peninsula there were more, the average knight was slightly closer to the Inete model, yeah, but it was still a knight, essentially it's the same thing. It's just a minimal difference. It doesn't even make sense to distinguish the two things tactically speaking, because there were heavy knights and then the jinetes just as skirmishers, right? A character of Italy that I would say, however, is that it seems to me, albeit there have been studies that show otherwise, that there wasn't much of lighter troops, right? Figures like javeliners, also mounted crossbowmen, I mean, they were there. You find them, but it's as if the main shock force was heavy cavalry. There wasn't much of a softening up to other means. Like the crossbows especially had absorbed every other type of missile offensive capability, and so Italian armies are very frontally tough. Like they have this idea that it's still very aggressively feudal in mindset. Like it's very, very, very important to stress here that the popular mindset, the fact that it was on average more infantry here, doesn't change the essentials that warfare gravitated around heavy cavalry, right? The Italian elites at this time were reading French courtly romances. They were fascinated. Even if you look at their heraldic, it's an anachronistic term from that time. They were strongly feudal. Even that there was this kind of still Germanic influences in the mindset of the warrior. This kind of individualistic attitude, right? That is typical of the medieval knight. That created problems. So you will not find here that strict discipline that there could be in a Roman legion, right? It was conceptually something very different, also different times, different technologies, but I mean, here there is no state. So the city-state is something that goes close to it, but at the same time, these armies were still a kind of a group of people that were put together from very different backgrounds, a lot of allies every time. What you find in these Italian armies all the time is people coming from every freaking where. Like, you find, the average Florentine army at the end of the 13th century, what is it? You have the bulk of Florentine citizens, then you find, French or German mercenaries, then you have Romagnol, other cavalry or infantry specialists, you find other guys from, the Roman countryside, things like these, literally. So it's also, think about the discipline of such groups. Like, tactics were they were advanced, as we have seen for those time standards, but at the same time were fairly simple in the functionment, right? So that we also don't have to squeeze too much our brains thinking how complicated certain things were. Like we actually know, because if you look at Europe, you know what military history was at that point. You're much more advantaged, and as I often say on Schwerpunkt, when I make these videos, I always try to stress the differences, because it's cool, like, that I make a video about, the Hungarian Knight, the Italian Communal Army, the German infantry, things like this, right? But because they're spicy, they're peculiar, they're kind of, unique. But at the same time, this whole world is dramatically homogeneous. And that's the very first thing you have to think every single time. right? And what is interesting here is also the European perspective, because literally, and especially towards the end here in the 13th century, you find mercenaries from everywhere, right? Even Italians actually went fighting. For example, it's very interesting during the French-Flemish Wars that the French, after Courtrai, where they were defeated, the cavalry was defeated, they hired through certain Italian contractors from Lombardy and Tuscany that were at the court of Philip IV, actually Italian infantry, and that those specialized pikemen, I don't remember where even the Pavises, but also especially pikemen, to fight against the Flemish infantry. And these pikemen also behaved pretty well in Flanders. And it seemingly it also created surprise and even fear among the Flemish, because seemingly they hadn't met that type of infantry, which is kind of fascinating, because those were the years in which the Flemish had managed to, defeat, once again, the flower of French cavalry. And yet they were surprised by Italians that supposedly had an infantry in decline, and instead, triggered kind of respect and even concern among the Flemish that saw them. So it's kind of fascinating, and I suspect that that's a very interesting field of further research, maybe, because I checked some Flemish chronicle talking about it, and it seems it's rather the Italians who talk about that, but also the Flemish register. In that occasion, especially, and that's kind of interesting, because it says something like Italian cavalry and Spanish infantry, which is kind of fascinating, and this all in French service, right? And that tells you how much contact there was between all these various areas of Europe. We're not talking, we'll see it better now at the end, this massive, and I mean massive amount of French and German mercenaries that come in Italy. But consider that this is also after 1266, first of all, during the Hohenstaufen period, there are lots of Germans that go fighting and dying in Italy, and that are also settled as feudatories in the Kingdom of Sicily. There are, eventually after 1266, the Angevins were settled in Naples. Eventually the Aragonese in Sicily, and there are the Catalans around. So, and you find all these mercenaries actually in the center and north of Italy, because they're fighting either for the Germans or for the, the Guelphs are fighting, with the support of the Angevins, hence of Naples and of France, and the Ghibellines with the support of Germany, or at least the part of Germany that at that point supported where the empire was standing. So you see that there was there were also English mercenaries. We will see it now, but not the famous John Oakwood. We're talking about earlier times. Here, these ones, the 13th century. But this was the norm. Like, foreign mercenaries always been around, and so this is for saying that there was a shared European military culture, which is very, very, very important in my opinion. And in fact, it's witnessed by the fact that usually these troops all fought in the same way, right? So where were we here? There are all these numbers can be. Well, maybe one day I will make a video about what I found out with the number comparisons, were very interesting. There is a beautiful study by Wiley that studied the Florentine armies and militias especially, and that looked at the book of Montaperti that we mentioned before, and he drew this list about the army of Florence in that occasion. So it turns out that in the Florentine army there were 1,400 approximate knights of the Commune, right? So Florentine knights. Then the Carroccio guards, 153 infantry. So the Carroccio, as you know, was this kind of cart that was loaded with the. At the beginning, historiography thought it was a symbol of the city, but it was more like a symbol of the people, right, of the popular classes, and was the Christian paraphernalia, symbol of the cross and and of the city, right? It was the like if you lost that, the city lost its honor, basically. And in fact, if you look at the Battle of Lignano, for example, the Milanese that stand around the Carroccio, right? It also served as a point of, like a standpoint, because it was also big, and with a flag, and you know how important that was also. And it was the last stand, right? If you had to make a last stand, you would do it there. And it was manned by infantry, interestingly enough. So naturally, infantry can defend, cavalry can't defend unless it dismounts. So it was manned by this large amount of infantry, and also actually 48 cavalry, right? So yeah, defensive and counter-offensive power. Then mercenary cavalry, over 200. City infantry approximate 4,000. City crossbowmen 1,000, and this is a high proportion. City archers 1,000. So this is interesting because before I said archers were smaller in number, and this is actually true. They were much smaller, but on that occasion you find that here the Florentines have as many archers as crossbowmen, right? Which is fascinating. They lost anyway. So then the city Pavisari, there were approximately 300, and you see here how few they are. And this is interesting because if given that they were normally to shield crossbowmen, at least as far as we understand, they were a relatively thin line, right? There are more than 3 crossbowmen for one Pavisarius, let's say. And then the Contado infantry of 8,000, right? The total is over 16,101, right? So that's an interesting segment, but you can find it, you know, at least as sums, right? In many other contexts. Usually, the sources distinguish the cavalry from infantry, numerically speaking. That's their normal thing. Every once in a while, they add like there were that certain amount of crossbowmen because they were more important than the others, and the other footmen, right? And or the long spears, for example, or the Pavismen, but that's it. So let's pass at the people, the popolo in Italian. So the popolo was this side of was a political body essentially that evolved in most cities in the early 13th century, right? And it had its own unit of militia, right? It was kind of an elite troop. We'll explain now. I mean, they weren't actually elite because they were still populars, right? But as we were saying, especially in the city streets, especially if they were well equipped as they were, usually, especially with pavises and pikemen and crossbows that they had, right? And incidentally, in high numbers in here, was designed to check the power of a city's own magnates and the ambitions of its nobility whenever it felt to be necessary. So before we didn't make a dramatic difference, at least from a terminological point of view, that the militia that we said before, the knights, were called the milites. The footmen were the pedites. Now, the footmen were not militia, as we have seen, because we have explained that the militia is just the knights. It's the properly military professionals. It's not like in the common use of the term, right? So who were the pedites? Right, the footmen, basically no one. They were just freemen, but they didn't have the honor of the cingulum militaris, right? The knights were knights. They were dubbed, right? Around the dubbing here, it's a bit complicated because not all knights were really dubbed. But I mean, the idea of being just a heavily armored cavalryman with a sword and legs with full equipment was enough to say, okay, you are a military man, right? The dubbing ceremony was an extra for the elite, right, for the truly nobility elite. Sometimes it involved the dubbing from the side of the emperor or the Angevin monarchs, you know, these recognized feudal authority of Europe that gave prestige to these militias of, effectively, of commoners, right, that however had become noblemen because they were simply rich, very, very, very rich. So much they paid, you know, for the expeditions of the same Angevins into Sicily, right? Because the papacy subcontracted the you know the expedition from that way to the Tuscans chiefly. So the Pavises were really nobodies in some ways, right? They were still citizens, so yeah, they were privileged compared to the peasants, but a nobleman would look at them and say, blah. I mean, these are like inferiors, and this is interesting because in the 13th century, what happened to the militia? It basically ceased to be inclusive because there were so many people growing in the city, and so many people who were evidently not interested in war and such that even if they were becoming rich, there were too many to integrate into the elite, right? So the militia kind of crystallized and kind of opposed itself to the people, right? So the people properly, the popular, right? It was this association, sometimes of very wealthy commoners, actually, that sometimes had in turn their own, capacity of fielding cavalry, right? There were popular knights in this sense as well, and that started in this sense competing with the so-called magnates. That this wasn't really interpretable as a class conflict, because there is a bit of class conflict as well, but sometimes it was a factionary one. Like the magnates weren't just literally all the people who were so rich that were fearful, right? There were the people who were rich but were also considered for other political reasons enough dangerous for taking over the city, right? And there would be still a coexistence of populars and magnates, right? Most of all, these magnates sometimes, at the best, they maybe were excluded by the city councils or prevented from participating to the army. At the worst, actually, they could be exiled or their houses destroyed, their goods confiscated, right? Many of them took refuge in the countryside. Sometimes they were attacked even there. Sometimes, actually, they came back to the city, and also the seigneurial affirmation actually passes through that phenomenon in part because still the people needs military experts. Like, what here, the concept here is that the people, the common people, suck at fighting, right? As always, right? You need military professionals to fight, and that's, as always, the point. Like, the people can mount up this outrageous strength in the city streets. Like, if you look at these popular revolts in communal Italy, these are some of the most radically violent encounters you can ever find in here. And there is even an example of anthropophagy against political enemies. I mean, these people did some of the most horrible thing, because the popular classes are instinctively the most violent ones. Like, the great masses are freaking dangerous when they get triggered. Like, and we all know about this. And I mean, of course, it was an oppression. Of course, the magnates had become violent. I mean, they were like a bit mobsters. Like, that's what feudal culture is in a nutshell. They're not like the mob. They're effectively the mob, right? The people works, and they have shops. They care about especially the economical wealth of the city. They don't understand absolutely anything about the military affairs, but when they get triggered because they're losing too much money, they start, getting their own weaponry that they also produce, because sometimes they're same craftsmen that produce weapons for the knights, right? For the magnates themselves, and they make this terrible mess in the city, and the magnates fear these guys, right? The magnates come, as we've seen from this military experienced families that know all about the business of war and know how to seize power, right? But sometimes when the people shows up, they look at how they entrench themselves in the houses, in the cities, in the streets. I mean, how they barricade everything, how they start taking crossbows and pikes, and think that makes them freak out, right? And that is enough in many cases to prevent actually coup d'états, right? The Florentines know something about it, because in Florence there is not necessarily the harshest anti-magnate law ever. That's in Parma, in this city that in Emilia, it was an agricultural region of the Po Valley that was, had a few industries but a lot of agricultural resources. The people were stronger. Like, that has the most ferocious and uncompromising anti-magnates law. But in Florence, where in Parma effectively the people will be defeated at the end and the signory instated, a foreign signory by the way, but to a brief episode of an actually Parmesan lord. But in Florence there is a bit of a hybrid, right? The richer magnates are freaking rich, and this is what saves also Florence from all its defeats on the field, because they don't have a lord like Lucca will have, like Pisa will have, that will kick their ass on the field. But the point is, because these people the lords really know what's the business of war. The people doesn't, the popolo does not. So this will favor, however, a certain, hybridization, I don't know how to say that, between the oligarchies and the magnates at some point. But especially from during the 13th century, especially after the second half of the 13th century, where Frederick II dies, so the effort of the Italians will be directed now from an external enemy to an internal one. These popular units began to form, and there are usually a few thousand of men, right? Soundly equipped with anti-cavalry weapons, chiefly crossbows, pikes, etc. And they were all infantry usually. They had their own elite of cavalry sometimes, but they weren't so good, right? That's also a problem. Why, when you kick out the magnates, you lose also part of the best cavalry in the city. Hence, you have to hire mercenaries. The problem is that the popular classes do not have a military education, so also from a political point of view, you can't just make a government just without taxes. You have to take the reins at some point, right? And in Florence, the oligarchs were so powerful that at one point they do, and therefore the republic survives in many ways. In other cities, it doesn't work well for them. The popolo really makes a very atrocious end at the end of the day, because it kind of deserved it, because the popolo is evil. Let's be honest about it. I know I'm probably biased under this point of view because I studied exactly this point, and to me there is this unappealable defeat of the people that you must explain from a political and military point of view when the signories arise, right? So partially it's actually a natural evolution, it doesn't even pass through bloodshed, right? It's the same people at one point recognizes it needs a lord because they can't handle the situation, but it's still a defeat. So that's how it went on. And these were companies that had their own military regulations, right? They probably, in the case of Florence, at least in 1250, they're the first people, because they had another reform at the end in the 90s. They had 20 companies, probably of 100 men, right? And at the top, in charge, the command of the popolo, there was a captain that figured at that point also a political representative of the people in the communal institutions and on campaign, right? That is quite interesting because, for example, in Parma that we mentioned before, there was a time, especially towards in the 90s of the 13th century, where the captain of the people basically signed the podesta in every single military expedition, so it shows you that in that case the people wanted to control every single thing that Podesta did with the communal military, right? And the objective was usually basically sacking the magnates' properties in the countryside, right? Step by step. And yeah, because the people wanted essentially that, just to economy to work well, and not paying taxes just to make a freaking lot of money. Yes, but when you do this in a major international upheaval in which there is the construction of new powers, the shifting of different balances, and effectively economical crisis and recession, at one point this system can't hold, right? And you must make war. The people doesn't know anything about it. It loses, to make it a long story short. There were other cities in Italy that had a earlier seigneurial tradition. Before we mentioned Ferrara, for example, that had the Este since a long time. They were happy about it. The same people was happy about it, and the Este remained famously up to the modern age, one of the most famous European families. But also, usually, I mean, the variables for the rise of the seigneuries and in certain areas are not always the same, right? For example, Modena was a very small commune for the surrounding standards. They fought against Bologna was a giant in comparison, but it was under usually the Mantuan seigneury of the Bonacolsi, but nevertheless it had an extremely strong people, at least at some point in the early 1300s, and it in there it's inexplicable, because it's a small city, it's governed by a foreign rule, and it still has a strong people, and it doesn't do, I mean, it fights harsh against the enemies, but doesn't rebel, doesn't do anything. Other cities are much more, well started, and they have a precocious rise of seigneuries. Think about the Veronese March, for example. It was a bit more feudalized than other areas of the Povla, like to tell it all, but at the same time, it's the variables are so many you can't generalize about one specific factor. So, in conclusion, and still we have a lot to talk about now, let's talk about the mercenaries. Right, the mercenaries are a very important element, especially in the 13th century communal armies, because mercenaries had always been there, right? But initially in Italy, you don't find so many of them after all, right? We'll see better when you talk about papal armies that had on average much more extra money to spend. But it was really about the fact that as long as the city worked with its own political and military resources, it was fine, right? As long as the common interest of the city was univocal, right? There was no need to recur to external troops. The people were enough committed to military expeditions against the enemy cities, right? It was fine. They wanted to be in charge of the situation, even on the field. There was definitely a contrast between the knights and the people, even at some points, so that certain campaigns were decided by even, I don't know, the people escaped, or maybe the people was too strong that the knights escaped and they left the people being butchered by the enemy. But in the 12th century, as we were saying before, the armies functioned pretty well. They were pretty solid. And there were a few mercenaries. But by the end of the 13th century, lots of things change. First of all, Italy is really rocketing, economically speaking, but there is also some shattering event, like the Barbarossa campaigns, right? There are crises, there is increased social stratification, right? But what happens normally at this point is still basically the army of some other commune that goes in to help another commune. Like, I don't know, I am Pavia, let's say, and I want help from Tortona, right? And I say, Tortona, come here with 200 cavalry, because I need you now for this military expedition. And that would do, right? And then maybe Pavia would send other troops, and maybe there were other that would come from the, I don't know, from some Alpine lord, and it would go like that, more or less. And this was really typical. If you take the Lombard League or the Bernese League, that's essentially it. There were lots of cities that put their limited amount of troops together to create an army that could even defeat the imperial army. So it was an effective system, as you understand it. This is really typical. As we were saying before, also the fact that all the cities were so close and well connected, made it easier, right? And these were, by the way, there was an old link between all these cities, right? They all knew each other. These people were speaking the same language, right? So there wasn't like a barrier that they felt like, even if Italy didn't have a kingdom, didn't have a king, right? Let's say better, had a kingdom, but there was still this idea that there had been a Longobarд kingdom, that these people were part of the same, they were under same law, right? So even the communal split didn't actually bring an end to a shared kind of proto-national identity in these cases. I mean, the Lombards perceived themselves as Lombards, the Tuscans, Tuscans, and there was a vague idea that there were Italians in some way, right? And also, if you read the vernacular of the time, they, you can understand it even now from an Italian perspective, and at the same time, it's very, very similar. I mean, it's obvious that these people actually understood each other, and that's fantastic, because aside from the fact that Latin in part was still used as a literary language, but there was a shared culture at the base, and communal Italy was completely interconnected in this regard. Never think these guys minding just about their backyard. These guys knew literally everything about what was happening all over the region, because it was their interest to be so. They had merchants everywhere, right? So there's a kind of a cohesion that is sometimes said, these guys just fought each other, they didn't have any unity, any identity. That's actually grossly false, and this is at least evident to everyone who knows a bit about the Italian side from history, but also literature, but even art from the time. You see it quite clearly. Like, there was an enormous shared traffic and circle of resources, of ideas, of language was developed intensely, also beyond the literary language. Like, the Italian vernacular pops out as a literary language quite late compared to other areas, because Latin was more in use than a literary language. But when Italian comes out as a vernacular language, you realize it's dramatically developed. It's very, very articulated. So whichever was the elite writing like in Latin, still the rest of the people had developed quite common and functional language everywhere. They had evolved along the same pattern, right? This is something that's often overlooked when talking about Italian history, because there are some nationalistic and anti-nationalistic perspective in this regard that kind of trying to misrepresent a little bit what the cultural background this world was, right? So what else? So this sharing of troops, we have, among at least some of the first mercenaries employed outside of the papal state, we have the one from the city of Fiesole, next to Florence, basically, that dates to 1124. However, there was a gradual increase in the use of genuine mercenaries, as opposed to paid allies, right? Especially throughout the 13th century. And this was spearheaded by the largest and richest cities like Milan, Genoa, also Siena, in the 20s and the 30s of the century. Genoa employed 500 mercenary cavalry as early as 1227. So what were these people? Well, these were basically a mix. They were still largely Italians at this point, but they were also already foreigners, as always. But there were people you could literally find around, right? Actually, as far as I've seen, I'm convinced that most of mercenarism at the time started developing through the this reliance on help from a city to another, right? Because there is not much of a difference after all. We were the salaried cavalry that the Commune employed on a regular basis. There is always this increasing detachment between the military professional and the average guy remains home, right? So what's the difference where they come from or who they are, right? In my opinion, not much, because they were still the same people living in those cities or countryside. So the influx of mercenaries was in part at least a result of the obligation of individual cities, in fact, to supply troops to the allied armies of various city leagues, such as the Lombard League and the Tuscan Guelph League. These were, we'll see later, the Talia system, for example, that basically it was certain cities together that instead of sending troops to each other, they would basically hire mercenaries altogether, which means that they put a lot of money in common proportionally to their capabilities, and they would hire someone with that. And this naturally simplifies much the matters, especially for larger armies, right? It was kind of effective. So In here you can see how, for example, the difference between Lombardy and Tuscany, because Lombardy did this mostly during, like, the league was still functioning chiefly through civic contingents sent together. Like, the Tuscans and other Central Italians start levying some mercenaries basically later on in the 13th, because in general much more gentrified, and therefore there were less people who would go in the army when they had the money instead to pay for someone else going in their stead. So the mercenaries continued to consist mainly of Italians from other cities, but by the second half of the 13th century, they were otherwise chiefly French and German in composition. I mean, the Germans, especially, becoming the most numerous element by the early 14th century. By that time, it's been estimated there were roughly 10,000 German, chiefly knights, right? These were called Oltramontani in Italian, because basically it meant Transalpine, right, beyond the Alps. And albeit the Germans dominated numerically and also in military quality, there were lots of other, like usually the French as we've seen, but also Burgundians, for example. And it's interesting also to see this area in between France and Germany, because the chronicles say that these people usually knew how to speak both French and German, right? Because they weren't objectively in between, they were somewhat similar. But it's obviously a synecdoche. Like, who knows? There surely were, I don't know, Hungarians maybe, people from maybe Tramontani, but they were English, right? So it's varied, but we're chiefly Germans. And if you look at an average contingent in a Florentine army in 1270, this consisted of Lombard, Catalan, Provençal, and German mercenaries, right? The Catalans were around the Mediterranean this time. The Provençals, especially when after the Angevins conquer Naples from Provence, in fact, are present as commanders, etc. They're important also in the papal armies later on. They're often used, and this picture is very typical, and typical of the end of the period, right? There were also a small number of Englishmen, as we were saying, were sometimes hired. Bologna had perhaps 100 of them, in 100 English men at arms in their employ at some time, and you find them scattered. But it wasn't they wasn't normal, right? There were few. And before long, mercenaries were usually contracted for 2 or 3 months at a time, right? And this actually reflects how, you know, from seasonalism to professionalism, Italian warfare had transitioned, like, at the end of the 13th century, right? At this point, like, yeah, during autumn and winter, war would be rare, right? In Southern Europe, yes, campaigns normally lasted longer, but, you know, at the beginning of bad season, they would basically stop, also because Italy is objectively not that warm, and we're also in times now where climate is cold, and apparently, and and in winter either, of course. Usually that was the moment better for blitz operations, storming castles by surprise, things like that, but not for the army. That started in spring and summer, and that was it. And 2 or 3 months at a time is in fact the time of a normal military season, and these mercenaries were recruited ad hoc for those. And they were principally cavalry. This is the interesting side of the story that also explains, that at least shows how cavalry also started gaining ground. These people were demanded increasingly, because cavalry was still decisive, tactically speaking, right? And Italy the development of Italian infantry, as we've seen, dies earlier than the rest of certain areas of Western Europe, but these will effectively die out after a few decades as well, right? So, and cavalry will take over again. So it's interesting to parallel this trend and this sort of refeudalization of European warfare by the mid 14th century. Don't trust those who tell you that, you know, it's so simple that from 14th century the increase of infantry importance was linearly uninterrupted. This is actually false, right? And it also changed on very important political and social basis. It's not because new technologies were invented, right? That is not the point. It was a deep political and social change, especially with Black Death and other, also the crisis of the 14th century in general. However, there are still some infantrymen, especially crossbowmen, that were employed, right? I found even pikemen, long spears, being employed as mercenaries, and they're the same ones they sent, the French sent in Flanders from Lombardy. So this witnesses actually the professionalization also of these infantry in some regard. And this is interesting, especially for the pikemen, because the pikemen, in order to be effective, as we have remembered, have to be many. So the fact that there are, professional pikemen is frankly astonishing, because I don't know in any other place in Europe at this point of professional pikemen, aside maybe from certain regions like Brabant, right? But it's still, meaningful that there are such military professionals much earlier than the most canonical revival of pikemen in the 15th century, right? And once again, Italy and Flanders are the areas you have to look at in that point. Crossbowmen are also famously employed. Genoa was the capital of crossbowmen, and it did something similar to what the Swiss would do later. That is, that basically those city mercenaries were controlled by the state. There weren't a random Genoese wandering around Europe. Like they belonged to Republic of Genoa. That trained them and made money with their rent and so on. And Genoa was specialized in this, and the reasons why is it's a mix of reasons. First of all, it seems that crossbow had a greater importance in naval operations. This is true. The territory of Liguria is, increases dramatically with gravity. The need of having crossbows, because it's all mountains. It's terrifying, like Liguria. In fact, there are not pitched battles in Liguria because the terrain is hellish in that regard. But still, you can pick down, you can suppress the enemy with crossbow fire quite easily. Also, infantry is more developed in Liguria. That has not to do with socio-economical reasons, but with others. But there are smaller bodies of crossbowmen that certain cities especially have. For example, it seems that Siena had it was kind of made some sound employment of crossbowmen as well. Certain cities in Umbria did as well, probably because of the Apennines as well, who knows. The Pisa did. Pisa is in a flatland, still uses crossbowmen, so it's not just about the terrain, as always. But it's interesting that certain cities develop. In fact, the crossbowmen are usually those very few units that the communes permanently maintain in a certain number, and that they train intensely. They pay for the resources of training, right? So they want to have trained professional crossbowmen at their disposal, because those, especially in sieges, are very, very effective, and they're needed both in attack and defense, right? But the same Siena hired 400 Genoese and 300 Spoletan crossbowmen. Spoleto is another city of Umbria, and it was famous for crossbowmen as well. This was as early as 1231. Of 7,750 Florentine infantry recorded in 1302, as many as 1,000 were mercenaries. Right. After 1267, the cavalry tended to be employed in these units known as conestabileria or conestabilia, so the constabularies, right? This word now gradually replacing the earlier masnada, which had been used in Italy to denote a small unit of soldiers since at least the 12th century, right? The masnadas were these literally bands of mercenaries, right? And it's a term you still find employed, but the idea of the constabularies reflects rather the fact that the figure of the constable is increasing in importance, because it's an increasingly professionalized individual that makes some money now making through the condotta contracts, right? So it's in the 13th century that the condotta actually begins, right? It's simply a hiring contract. That's all it is. And this cavalry is to be found increasingly easier. You just needed to have money. You could find all the people you wanted there. There was definitely no shortage of it, right? Constabularies were most commonly of 25 or 50 men, right? But sometimes they comprised 100 or more, right? These were brigaded usually all together in the cavalry, and their strength varied enormously, right? As an example, 6 constabularies hired by Perugia in 1282 totaled 380 men, while 8 constabularies employed in 1300 by Florence, 2 consisted of 40 men, 1 of 30, 1 of 25, 3 of 20, and 1 of as few as 5, right? So you can understand here that it's a market. There are, the future is obviously towards the military company that is like at the extremes, literally an army on its own that you can hire, right? And at this point, that's what the system is compacting. Like, I made a video more than 1 year ago, I think it was, about the rise of mercenary companies in 13th century. And I talk about this. If you're interested, if you've got medieval warfare playlist, you should find. As we were saying, the commander of such units bore the title of constabilis, the constable, regardless. The evolution towards larger companies is observable by the fact that certain constabularies, for example, of 100 men or more, could be divided into smaller troops, right? Their officers being called gonfalonieri, that is standard or banner bearers, right? This is normal because, as we were saying before, the smaller tactical unit on the field were usually a platoon size, like 25 to 50 men. Right, and that's what would you command as a smaller unit on the field. So if you had larger numbers of troops, organic is not an opinion. It's there just to serve your tactical purposes. You split these troops to make them more flexible, and cavalry was very, very flexible. In these encounters, like in most battles, there were repeated charges, and if you look at how this whole thing worked, as we were saying before, there was no one that could impose a totalizing discipline on these troops. So sometimes clashes would start spontaneously. I don't know, there were maybe 2 armies that were confronting each other, building their camps or field fortification. Then maybe, 10 knights would start engaging fight with 10 knights from the other side, and other knights would draw in the battle, and sometimes, this would start, large-scale engagements, and it was that weird, but it was still functional to warfare at that time, and there was always this idea of bravery and chivalric madness and, fanatic courage, right? There was even dangerous sometimes. The same Italian cavalry usually was brigaded in some private companies that were inspired, to King Arthur or, the paladins of Charlemagne, right? They swore this oath of allegiance. They were a bit of a club, right? And their objective was to be kind of, suicidal in battle. And they were thrown among the feritori, for example. And so, for example, the Germans were especially like that. I'm collecting an astonishing amount of information about Germans being at the point of, a reckless behavior, like it's just simply throwing themselves against the enemies, no matter what. They find this tempered, this mindset that came from Germany, where, Germany had this dramatic situation of never having a concrete border from the eastern side. So they always fought with an incredible number of populations. It was a poorer society. It was more feudal in nature. So they retained more this warlike mindset. And now, especially with the crisis of the ministeriales in the late 13th century, with the affirmation of principalities in Germany, they remained unemployed. in part, or at least they went in Italy to make money because there was full of money there, and so you find so many Germans, and they behave strangely, but they're effective. Like, everybody recognized the fact that they are hell of soldiers, and that they're especially fanatically courageous, right? At the point sometimes of, some simply get slaughtered, right, because of that. But generally speaking, it's that being very, very effective, especially in shock charges, right? In this fanatic heroism, charging against all the odds, right? It's a matter of name, right? And not all Germans went there on their own. Like, sometimes there were imperial vicary officers, things like these. They were people who eventually came back to Germany after they had made a living, and sometimes miserable life, but some made money, and they stayed, in fact. Then there were other figures in these companies who were taking shape, such as captains, so lesser, sub-officers, in trumpeters, trumpeters, sorry, etc. And the officers were normally expected to have 3 horses each, so that they were also usually better equipped, right? Though their men customarily had only 1, right? The tendency will be to increase the term of the lances of the Barbute also, that had 2 or 3 horses, and a relative also troops. But at this point, like, it's 1-to-1, right? They have 1 milas. Yeah, they can have 1.5 horse, for example, or 2 or 3 even in some cases. But it's rare. And then the more horses they have, and the more that the heavier they are. Let's say, because they're evidently tougher troops, and in fact they're often associated when they have spare horses to the fact that they were armored. Cavalry properly. Even the horses, because they were wealthier, could afford also better equipment and spare horses. A Florentine condotta of 1277 required each man-at-arms to have a good war horse, full armor protecting body, neck, thighs, and legs, a helmet, shield, lance, sword, and knife. Consider that Italy at this point had, as we've seen, they were rich. They had a lot of this money. Italy was notoriously short in metals, but they had these armories in Milan and Brescia that were close to the Alpine areas. Still, they had some of the best armored armies there, because they either imported it or they still had the means to produce this mass production. Like, the Lombard armory production at this point is at the top in Europe. It will remain at the same throughout all the Middle Ages, right? They are kind of a proto-industrial production system. They also are fairly standardized, and especially if you look at at Milan, that you realize that they were pretty damn well equipped. Even in the popular troops, they had this sound individual wealth. I even made a video about that, about the material wealth of communal infantries that you can find also in other communal contexts. It's also famous, the cuir bouilli, so the boiled leather. That was a kind of a French invention, especially from southern France, apparently, that is this leather armor that wasn't definitely that spread at the time, but it did exist, and sometimes it was lighter. I don't know how, it was not that cheap, frankly, especially compared to Gambesson. Gambesson can do miracles, believe me. But also consider the weather. Like, think about fighting in Italy or in southern France in August, which did happen. We know that at certain points soldiers had to take off their armor because they were dying of heat. Like, it was incredible, and that is a big deal. And it happens also in other areas of Europe. Don't think that, but it's generally speaking also a reason why you think. But also the shortage of metals in Italy. In fact, there is a particular type of so-called Tuscan Provençal military style that saw the consistent employment, apparently at least, of cuir bouilli, that we get chiefly from the iconography. So we don't know some pieces if they were actual metal or boiled leather, but you know, and this was typical of the Guelph style, like this alliance between the Angevins of Naples and the Guelph Tuscans, right? They were the most numerous and strongest in Italy. And yeah, it's just a name. While it seems that especially the signories of northern Italy, Milan and Verona, started raising. They had more in Germany fashion. First of all, because they were Ghibellines, right, and they had imperial vicaries. They were in contact with Germany. I mean, they were next to the Alps, but also because of this reason. So Germany is from the other side, and for this reason, they hired, but because they were signories chiefly, this larger amount of mercenaries, most of which were German. Right, and from the 1320s, however, the Germans spread also in the Guelph system. But initially, it's possible that, and I see this in the sources, when the German mercenaries are often, you know, named sometimes as the Helms. Like, other troops are not called like that. And there's the idea that the Great Helm, that was typical of Germany, like together with other types of weapon and armor, was at the time a bit characteristic of the Germans. Albeit I must say that this is especially true from the troops coming from southeastern Germany. Like, not all the Germans in Italy were stereotyped like that, but the ones that were hired, especially in the northeast of Italy, that came from these areas also bordering the Slavic and Hungarian territory, they were knights at helm. They were called like that. And there was also an astonishingly high number of mounted crossbowmen, and I still can't find out why. I hypothesize that it's maybe the Hungarians have still this longer tradition of horse archery, that they somewhat, you know, influenced these areas of Kärnten or Steiermark with, you know, substituting with crossbows, but it's kind of a weak. I mean, it's not a bad hypothesis, actually, because you still see the Hungarians using loads of horse archers still in the 14th century. For example, the Venetian siege of Zara didn't end well for them. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, this is the idea that the Germans are on average better armored, right? Also because plate armor spread originally from Germany, and then eventually, at this point, you know, becomes homogeneous all over Europe. But at the end of the 13th century, but still there is a bit this cliche that you see also at the Battle of Benevento, for example, between Manfred of Swabia and the French Charles of Anjou, which the stereotype is that the German has the heavy helm, the cuirass, it's all heavy also, and while the Angevin has the chapelle de fer and the cuir bouilli, and uses daggers rather than big swords, the grande épée d'Allemagne in French. They were known as the swords of Germany were apparently larger, some reason. And so this kind of heavier versus lighter model that, you know, eventually blends in over time, and you can see this in Italy at the same time, right? The Friulan armies display this even in armor, that they're similar to Germany, for example. The Tuscan armies are influenced by the Guelphs, the Angevins in Naples, but you know, their influences we can't really tell precisely, where they're just shades in a pretty blended picture after all. So it was also from the 1260s onwards that mercenary companies often began to be employed on a permanent basis, right, paid for by the taglia system, right? It was this sum of money put together we were talking about before by certain cities, whereby in fact member cities of the League of Alliance each contributed towards supporting a predetermined number of men according to its means, right? And this spread the financial burden more evenly, making the employment far larger numbers of mercenaries possible, right? So this was a step forward in many ways, but it didn't quite continue for much. Like this is a tendency, since we're talking up to the 1300s, but eventually in the 1300s, it's entire companies that are hired usually by one single city that has hegemonized a certain area, rather than an alliance that basically crumbles as well. The Tuscan Guelph League employed as many as 2,500 cavalry. By this means in 1292, right? And the mercenaries were prevalently Provençals and other Frenchmen. And in addition to militia detachments totaling some 20,000 men contributed by the member cities. So there were also infantry mercenaries, or at least people who were paid as such, which is also meaningful because you must say, where do you take so many people? Telling the truth, these were Italians more likely because they were available there. You don't have tens of thousands of foreigners that are there just for being hired at one shot. Even the 10,000 Germans we were talking about before were scattered throughout all the peninsula, right? They weren't just concentrated. Yeah, maybe Milan and Verona, as we were saying, but they also were not the only thing that existed there. So yeah, and some indication of the overall numbers of mercenaries individually employed by the largest cities can be drawn from the contingents of 1,000 Italian cavalry hired by the Genoese in 1255, 800 French cavalry hired by Florence in 1267, and 600 more French cavalry in the service of Bologna 10 years later. So eventually there will be this steady increase in mercenarism that, as you know, will reach very large levels in the mid-14th century and still at the beginning of the 16th century was there. During the 14th century, the majority of mercenaries began to be foreigner. Then towards the end of the 14th century, they came back to be permanently, almost completely Italian. So what the condottieri basically start also to be institutionalized, etc., on a local base. But we must stress that in spite of this, the communal armies, in spite of their decline, right? Here today we didn't stress the fact because we stop at the 1300, right? So, but later on the communal army collapses, right? The countrysides get devastated by continuous war. There is, especially between the 10s and the 30s of the 14th century, a massive, and I mean a massive investment in war. Like Italy at one point kind of gets, you get that its kinetic energy gets exhausted, right? And this is true in many other countries. If you look at France during the 100 Years' War, eventually, there is a deep crisis that strikes everywhere, basically. Whatever the reason was, definitely war contributed heavily to it. And as a consequence, the districts get razed to the ground, hence the cities become poorer, people become poorer, hence there are fewer rich people, and they are mercenaries, and those are the lords, and more or less, these regional states are formed, the single cities are always less important. I made a video recently about the public officials in communal and seigneurial Italy that explain a little bit the process. So, as a consequence, the bulk of Italian infantry decreases in importance, right? It's still strong towards the tens of the. There is some in some islands, let's say, of across the central and northern Italy, infantry does remain important. Like, not all societies behave in the same way. Pisa, for example, that is declining in this period because it loses in 1284 at sea against the Genoese, and then it loses Sardinia to the Aragonese in the 1320s, but it still has dramatically strong infantry. The same is true, and it's a freaking big and wealthy city. Then the same is true from the small Modena. That is a kind of a very weak commune. Right, so you can't generalize. There are certain factors that should be better understood. In Piedmont, similarly, there is a persistency of infantry that is interesting, and whatever. But just to say that the communal armies are always there, like that. Aside from the mercenaries that become the bulk of professional forces, but still there is a militia, right? What will become the provvisionati, for example, because they also received a salary. In later times, you find the 15th century, especially, they're present in large numbers, but they weren't kind of campaign or pitched battle troops, right? They were usually, especially to man all the various fortifications that are becoming semi-permanent in the Italian countryside, and that's fundamentally it. But still, it's an important part of of medieval warfare, I would say, rather than Italian history, because objectively between the 12th and 13th century, no army was organized like this, and especially infantry had such an important role, right? If you look at battles as Carcano, Legnano, Fossanova, Fossalta, all these various, Cortenuova, by the way, there is this strong, and far beyond that, like, there's this persistence of infantry. Then towards the first decades of 14th century, it collapses. It gradually vanishes. Like, it's not even a big crack. It's just, yeah, there are major defeats of large infantry armies, but it's still a defeat of it's not of infantry in itself. It's sometimes they even fought well, right? It's more about the model of organizing this big city and peasant armies, right? This huge commitment of all the communal power in one shot that had get to the extremization of power. Like, there are similar changes. I think it was also doctrinal by a certain standard. I mean, they really thought it wasn't just social, like that the classes that represented these units were worn out. It's also that they probably deliberately changed policy of military organization. And these things happen historically speaking. Look at the Spanish War of Succession in the beginning of the 18th century. Like, you find these armies were so large that they couldn't even maneuver them anymore. At one point during that war, they decided to shrink the armies once again to concentrate more on quality and doing something else. Here happens something similar, in my opinion. Also because there is still an steady increase in military technology, right? Italy pioneers armor, firearm production. They have the best technology available at this point. Also, if you look at naval warfare, the Venetians together with the Mamluks are the most advanced navies at that point. It's a continuous progress after all. So all of this decadence, the idea of the fact that the civic militia declined, it's actually not a big tragedy as we see it. Surely for many people it was because it brought to the loss of political freedom, but even in there you realize that it was somewhat asked for the sake of protection in front of, crisis and war, and it was much more consensual than is often painted. So that this part of history should be consistently redrawn, and I hope to contribute in some way soon. But I think it was interesting to talk about it, and definitely we will talk about the Italian communal armies in the future. As you know, I want to cover all, if possible, all medieval history and military history specifically in detail, right? All the armies in Europe. And I'm glad that after 2 years I managed to talk about this, and there will be more. Way more, because different cities had different histories and organization and whatever. So there is really a lot to discuss. The single battles, by the way, are very fascinating. So for now, we can't stop it here. It was a long video, but it was worth it. And I know you're probably all plenty of different questions, like of misunderstandings, because I know that I read these things from a perspective that is different from the usual, because I'm committed in this thing, and I can maybe skip certain passages that you would have liked to know better. But I try to be, concise. Yes, you must be concise, because this was just an introduction. I repeat it, like talking for hours about these topics, but it's what you need to first of all understand in general what the hell we're talking about, because believe me, if you don't get it from this point of view, it's somewhat worthless, right? That there is a certain level of, you can't talk a lot about something but without actually getting the essence of it. And the essence is, especially in military history, is difficult to acquire because it requires a lot of time to get it. And this is kind of some of the, topics I know best, but what is fascinating is when you get one decently well, then you realize that also the others are kind of accessible, and that's what is of use. And you need a synthesis of some form that, however, must be substantiated with some evidence and some reflection. Otherwise, it's just if you don't applicate You don't make an effort to understand. You can even read thousands of books, but you will not get to the point, right? Alright, so I think for now we stop here, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.